When you look at the critical issues facing our world, what do you see? We see breakthrough medicines getting to patients in record time. We see harnessing natural gas, unleashing the promise of clean energy. We see engineers simulating the future to improve today. At Emerson, when issues become inspiration, focusing core strengths to create a better world isn't just a result, it's a responsibility. Emerson, consider it solved. When you look at the critical issues facing our world, what do you see? We see 1 billion more people breathing free. We see access to fresh food being the global norm, not the exception. We see homes staying cooler without the planet getting warmer. At Emerson, when issues become inspiration, focusing core strengths to create a better world isn't just a result, it's a responsibility. Emerson, consider it solved. We see harnessing natural gas, unleashing the promise of clean energy. At Emerson, when issues become inspiration, creating a better world isn't just a result, it's a responsibility. Emerson, consider it solved. We see engineers simulating the future to improve today. At Emerson, when issues become inspiration, creating a better world isn't just a result, it's a responsibility. Emerson, consider it solved. We see breakthrough medicines getting to patients in record time. At Emerson, when issues become inspiration, creating a better world isn't just a result, it's a responsibility. Emerson, consider it solved. We see access to fresh food being the global norm, not the exception. At Emerson, when issues become inspiration, creating a better world isn't just a result, it's a responsibility. Emerson, consider it solved. We see heating breakthroughs clearing the air for billions. At Emerson, when issues become inspiration, creating a better world isn't just a result, it's a responsibility. Emerson, consider it solved. We see homes staying cooler without the planet getting warmer. At Emerson, when issues become inspiration, creating a better world isn't just a result, it's a responsibility. Emerson, consider it solved.
One of the approaches that KKR takes in Asia is to be more of a holistic solutions provider to companies and to stakeholders in the marketplace. As the private equity industry has evolved and KKR has evolved, what we've done is we've created different tools to help our competitive advantage in the market, as well as the way in which we engage with our portfolio companies. We bring deep industry specialization, deep operational expertise, and a global platform that's really suited to helping these local companies grow. One of the key tenets of our strategy in Asia has been from day one, really localizing the investment teams. Asia is not one big market. It's a collection of 8 or 10 different local markets. So our approach has been really to hire local executives and build our business in each country around a talented team of locals. In the last 30 years, the world economy has globalized dramatically. A global network is critically important. The businesses that we're investing in Asia, whether it's China, India, or Vietnam, these companies are looking to maximize their global growth potential. Our ability to provide access to customers, distribution, know-how from around the world is a huge advantage as we deal with these companies. The hallmark of what we do is we take a long-term approach to investing. We're not worried about the quarter-to-quarter earnings. We're really focused on understanding what's going to drive sustainable value creation in businesses over 3, 5, 10 years. Asia today is an incredibly dynamic part of the world with some of the highest GDP growth rates we see. So our opportunity is to be partners with great local entrepreneurs. Some of the most exciting investment themes in Asia really revolve around the domestic consumption trends. You have around 60% of the global population living in Asia today. Some incredibly interesting demographics between China, India, and Southeast Asia revolving around the growing middle class, rising disposable incomes, and consumer power. In that context, when you think about industries like consumer products, retail, and healthcare, there are significant opportunities for investment. KKR's approach to private equity has always been around providing solutions to our partners. So our core business is really providing capital to great management teams and industry-leading franchises to help them really think about the long-term opportunity to improve their business and create value for shareholders.
Fluffy. Fluffy. Fluffy.
Good thing you can now view your bills online. Sign up for paperless billing today.
Every brand has a goal. To be this or that for the consumer. To do this or that for its audience. To fix this. To grow that. To build from scratch. At Team Asia, we take a holistic approach in solving marketing challenges and use a variety of channels to reach consumers in meaningful ways. Experience is the relationship we build between the audience and the brand. The integration of channels is what makes everything cohesive and relevant. This approach we call integrated marketing experience. Team Asia brings out the best in branding and design, events and activation, content marketing, digital marketing, and video production. Our team has the best players in the game, armed with the knowledge to implement a strong game plan that fits your goals. Are you launching a new brand? Are you creating a positive brand impression? If you're looking for ways to grow your brand, the first order of business is to choose a team of experts. We are Team Asia, and this is how we do it.
We have a lot of plans. Ang dami naming expansion plan. Tapos merong pandemic. Pero na-realize namin na we have to continue. I really felt that na yung solution namin is something na kakailanganin ng mga MSMEs. Alam naming mahirapan sila. Kasi nakita namin sa data na maraming Filipino MSMEs is focus lang locally. Yung pinakamerkado nila, dito lang sila nagbebenta sa Pilipinas. At yung channel nila, the way they sell in physical store. Tapos dito lang locally sa Pilipinas. So nung nag-lockdown, alam namin na wala silang bebentahan. Their business will stop. We saw a lot of solutions na nag-o-offer na bringing them online. Pero for us, bringing them online is not enough. Will not just make you online, but will also make you global. Maraming siyempre yung logistics companies sa Pilipinas. Pero nung nakausap namin yung FedEx, alam mo, iba yung gaan ng loob sa unang mo pa lang silang makausap. Naintindihan nila yung ginagawa namin. Ang gusto ko sa kanila is that they're willing to work with us na isang startup lang, bagong-bago pa lang. And we have a certain way of doing things. Pero sila, they willing to adjust or listen to that. Kasi ang pagpapadala ng produkto mula sa Pilipinas at sa ibang bansa, hindi siya madali. Kung wala sila, mahirapan kami na magpadala ng mga produkto sa ibang bansa. I'm proud of our Filipino products.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Welcome to the 9th Arangkada Philippines Forum, Foreign Investment in the Post-Pandemic Philippines. Our program will begin in a few minutes, but before we begin, a few reminders. We encourage everyone to actively participate in the discussions today, especially during the open forum and Q&A. Should you have questions, kindly type it in the Q&A box. You may find the Q&A icon at the bottom of the Zoom platform. Our speakers and panelists will be glad to answer them, given enough time. Should you have other questions after the forum, please do send them at forum@arangkadaphilippines.com. We invite you to tweet about the event by using the event hashtag Arangkada Forum 2020. We also invite you to like us on Facebook. That's facebook.com Arangkada Philippines. Follow us on Twitter at ArangkadaPH, and please do connect with us on LinkedIn by looking for Arangkada Philippines. Finally, we would like to ask everyone to answer a few poll questions that we will be flashing on the screen. We highly value your feedback. We will be putting out the poll questions in a little while. The first question is, does the Philippines need foreign investment? Since this Arangkada Philippines is all about foreign investment in the post-pandemic Philippines, that is what we are going to be taking up today. And we have a lot of interesting sessions that are going up. We also have some midday sessions that you will be invited to attend. It seems we have some issues with the polling questions at the moment on a technical basis. So please remain on your screens as we will now go on with the program. We would like to thank, of course, our sponsors and partners without whom this forum would not have been possible. First of all, we'd like to thank our platinum sponsors, Emerson, ICTSI, KKR, Meralco, and Team Asia. Our gold sponsors, Converge, FedEx, First Philippine Holdings, Royal Cargo, and Filipina Shell. Our silver sponsors, AIG, Bosch, Cal Energy, Capital One, Chevron, Quezon Power Limited, Santos Knight Frank, and SGV. Our virtual room sponsor, Eastern Communications. Our bronze sponsors, BDO, Manila Water, and Mitsubishi Corporation. Our patron sponsors, the Bank of the Philippine Islands, Isuzu International Workplace Group, Marriott International, Mawel Chemical Corporation, NYK Phil, and Sojit Ship Management Inc. Our supporters are Big Box, Maersk, MCX International, Procter & Gamble Company, the Philippine Sinter Corporation, SPI Global, Sun Life, and Tech Rep Inc. Our event partners, Bankers Association of the Philippines, the British Chamber of Commerce Philippines, CCI France Philippines, Chamber of Mines of the Philippines, Confederation of Wearables Exporters of the Philippines, Employers Confederation of the Philippines, the Electric Vehicle Association of the Philippines, Federation of Filipino Chinese Chambers of Commerce and Industry, the Foundation for Economic Freedom, the Government Academe Industry Network, the German Philippine Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Kiani Philippines, Makati Business Club, Management Association of the Philippines, Nordic Chamber of Commerce of the Philippines, the Philippine Ecozones Association, PhilExport Philippine Chamber of Food Manufacturers, Shareholders Association of the Philippines, and the Tax Management Association of the Philippines. Okay, let's now go to the poll questions once again. The first question, does the Philippines need foreign investment? Second, does the Philippines receive enough foreign investment? Are competing ASEAN countries more successful in attracting foreign investment? Is the Philippines an attractive location for foreign investors? Do the Filipino people want foreign investment? Do the Filipino elite want foreign investment? So this is a different question. Earlier it was the Filipino people, and this question is, do the Filipino elite want foreign investment? Does the current Philippine government want foreign investment? Does the government promote Invest Philippines adequately? Do you think manufacturers seeking an alternative site to the PRC will choose the Philippines? Should constitutional restrictions on foreign ownership be removed? Advertising, which is currently 70% Filipino and 30% foreign. Education, which is 60 to 40%, except for those established by religious groups and mission boards. For foreign diplomatic personnel and dependents, which may be 100% foreign owned. Land ownership currently at 60% to 40%. Media ownership currently at 100% Filipino. Public utilities currently at 60% to 40%. Telecoms currently at 60% to 40%. And transportation currently 60% to 40%. Thank you everyone for participating in those poll questions. Please do remain on your screens as we will begin the program shortly. We'd like to encourage everyone to join the midday and the afternoon breakout sessions that we have organized specially for this forum. Please visit www.investphilippines.info/forum 2020 under forum agenda, midday breakout sessions, and sign up for these virtual rooms to have access. In virtual room A, you will find Indonesia, the Philippines, and Vietnam, country challenges and prospects. This will be a special session with our partners from BRIANS and partners where their Indonesia, Vietnam, and Philippines country representatives will share their take on recent economic and political developments across the region amidst the COVID-19 crisis. The Philippines electronics industry in the midst of the pandemic. This session will focus on the strategies of the semiconductor and electronics industry on mitigating the negative impact of the pandemic, particularly in manufacturing, operations, and supply chains. If you head over to virtual room B later, you will be able to watch the state of the creative nation. This will be a discussion of the country's creative industry and its potential as a significant contributor to economic growth and post-pandemic recovery. This will be followed by an interesting session by Hannah Morales, where international award-winning Filipina photojournalist Hannah, who has been published by the world's most prestigious publications and media outfits, including the Washington Post, the New York Times, and National Geographic, will join us to talk about her work and her advocacy. And if you go to virtual room C, you will learn all about the IT-BPM state as of today. This will be a discussion on how the current global health crisis brought various changes in the way business process outsourcing works, a vital industry that employs more than 1 million Filipinos and contributes at least 9% of the country's GDP. So please head over to those sessions later when we announce it is time. And for now, ladies and gentlemen, let's all stand for the Philippine National Anthem, to be led by Froy Tahale. Alab puso sa dibdib mo
upang hinirang duyan ka ng mag-ibig manlulupi, di ka pasisip, kadagat at bundok sa simoy at sa langit mong bughaw, may dilag ang tula at awit sa paglayang minamahal, ang kislap ng watawat mo'y tagumpay na nagniningning, ang bituin at araw niya kailan pa may di magdidilim, lupa ng araw ng walahati pagsinta, buhay ay langit sa piling mo. Aming ligaya na pag may mga-api, ang mamatay ng dahil sa'yo.
Thank you, Froy, for rendering the Philippine National Anthem. And now to officially open the forum, let's give a warm welcome to the President of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce of the Philippines, Mr. Julian Payne.
Good morning. Good morning to all of you attending this 9th annual Arangkada Philippine Forum. It is my honor and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you on behalf of the 7 members of the Joint Foreign Chambers of Commerce of the Philippines. That is to say, the American Chamber, the Australian-New Zealand Chamber, the Canadian Chamber, the European Chamber, the Japanese Chamber, and the Korean Chamber, as well as Primary. This affiliated group represents firms from countries that altogether provide the largest total portion of foreign investment to the Philippines. I regret I cannot follow the very courteous Philippine tradition of introducing each and every one of the distinguished government office holders, business leaders, and ambassadors who are here with us today. There are just too many of you. But please know that we recognize you all, we welcome you all, and we appreciate your participation. And you will be recognized during individual speaker sessions and panels. As you know, we meet today under the most challenging of circumstances. Our lives and our businesses have been plagued in 2020 by the worst global pandemic in a century. Fortunately, modern science, working with the private sector, is starting to develop effective vaccines. Hopefully, some of these vaccines will be available here in the Philippines soon in the new year. But the future of our economy remains a great worry. The Philippines economy is in serious negative growth territory. The negative 8.4% growth projected for the Philippines in 2020 by the OECD is the worst amongst the major ASEAN 5 economies. And it's not forecast to recover to the 2019 levels until 2022. However, on the brighter side, Finance Secretary Dominguez has assured us that the path is clear to a strong bounce back next year. The Joint Foreign Chambers of Commerce will do everything possible with its mandate to support a sustainable recovery for the benefit of all. All of this brings me to the focus of the 2020 Arangkada Forum on Foreign Investment in the Philippines. We all know that foreign investment creates jobs in the Philippines. It increases exports and goods by the Philippines. It facilitates the transfer of technology to the Philippines. It supports competition for the benefit of the Philippine consumer. And of course, it pays taxes to support government programs. Further, most investors reinvest a significant portion of their gross profits for further development of their operations in the Philippines. But while foreign investment into ASEAN has grown to levels above 100 billion a year, that's more than goes to China, most of this foreign investment flows into Singapore, Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, and Malaysia. Comparable levels do not yet flow into the Philippines. The actual amount that flows into the Philippines reached 10.3 billion a year in 2017. It was slightly lower at 9.9 billion in 2018. It tumbled to 7.6 billion in 2019. Then, as of August 2020, that's this year, it was about 4 billion or 7% less than the same period in 2019. We must ask ourselves, why have foreign investors selected these other 5 ASEAN countries for more foreign investment than the Philippines? The decline in 2020 to date was certainly due in part to the pandemic. But the decrease started in 2018, before the pandemic. There can be no doubt that it was also due in part to the uncertainty about the content and date and approval of CREATE, including about the CIT reductions, as well as incentives for existing and future investors. Fortunately, with a very recent approval by the Senate of the CREATE, with some welcome amendments, many of these uncertainties are now being removed. But what are other disincentives for foreign investment in the Philippines that, after implementation of CREATE, still need to be recognized and rectified? In conclusion, let me say we look forward to a discussion of these issues during the next 2 days. And I would suggest we keep in mind 2 very fundamental questions. What increased target level of FDI should we aspire to over the next decade in a post-pandemic period? And second, what are the further post-create policy reforms, programs, and projects by both the government and private sector that will be critical to realize this increased target level of foreign investment for the benefit?
Thank you very much, Mr. Payne. And now to tell us what to expect in today's program, we have the Senior Advisor of the American Chamber of Commerce of the Philippines, Mr. John D. Forbes.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me clearly, and I have a few slides that I will ask to be put up. Welcome to the 9th Annual Arangkada Philippines Forum. We have almost 900 participants who will be visiting us over the 3 days. I'd like to welcome everybody individually, such as the several European ambassadors, the Canadian ambassador, the Embassy of Japan, Singapore, the United States, local government officials, including several governors and mayors, a large contingent from DTI at the trade attaches at Philippine embassies, the World Bank, DFA staff and middle-level officials looking in, and from the Senate, Senator Pimentel, and many congressional staff and many others from the business and media. Welcome to our forum. I'll quickly review what we hope to accomplish over 3 days, and particularly today. If I could have the next slide, please. Of course, I have to thank our corporate sponsors, of which we have a total of 36. I wish I could thank you all individually, but we will sound that out during the course of 3 days. And in addition to our corporate sponsors, next slide, we have a large number of table sponsors and of course our media sponsors. And we're in partnership with the University of the Philippines Public Administration Foundation and USAID. Next slide, please. We have 49 speakers, not counting our breakout sessions. This is the most robust, we call it the biggest and best program that we have had. And pardon us if our technology does not always work perfectly, because this is the first time we've tried something so ambitious. Next slide, please. With respect to today's program, we will start with what I'm sure are very, very interesting speeches from Jaime Augusto Isabel de Ayala that follows next, followed by Secretary Ramon Lopez of the Department of Trade and Industry. And then we will have panel 1, which will bring in the senior partner, managing partner for Southeast Asia for McKinsey and Company from Singapore, along with panelists Hans Rins, also from Singapore, and Ronald Mendoza from Ateneo, and Dindo Manhit from the ADR Institute Stratpace Group, to be moderated by Patrick Cook, who is coming in from Dubai. Patrick's a resident of Manila, however. And in the middle, as Manette has already explained, are the breakout sessions. I encourage, you can register for multiple ones and go to them, but there are 3 of them at noon of the country challenges. You can learn how the Philippines compares to Vietnam and Jakarta, the wonderful slides of the exciting creative industries from Paulo Mercado. And you can register if you haven't at investphilippines.info forum 20, or scan, I think we have a QR code somewhere around here. I don't see it right now. And next at 12:45, we will continue breakout sections. Next slide. On Dan La Chica, whoops, you went back, let's go back. Dan La Chica, and Hannah Morales that Manette was speaking about, and Ricky Salvador for the still growing BPO industry. Next slide, please. In the afternoon, starting at 1:30, we'll have our second panel, where our guest speaker is the Undersecretary for, I think it's Competition and Innovation at DTI, Yusek Fita Aldaba, with panelists, the president of the IBPAP, Rayon Tal, Paula Mercado, the president of the Creative Economy Council, Dr. Lachika of CEPI, and moderated by Coco Aquaz, the executive director of MBC. And then we'll wrap up at 3 p.m., where we have a showing of a webinar on public health coming from Singapore, China, and the Philippines. Very interesting. I encourage you to look at that too. We will be publishing a policy brief, not today, but after the forum, where we will publish the poll that Manette was reading out earlier. So please answer the poll as it is, you're asked to during the course of the forum. And we will have a large matrix comparing factors investors look at in Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, and the Philippines. Some remarks of Secretary Lopez, testimonials of major investors from different countries in the Philippines, and other materials will be in this policy brief. It will be an online policy brief. With that, I would like to end my slides. Thank you, and introduce our speaker. It's a distinct pleasure for me to introduce Jaime Augusto Zubeldo Ayala, who is the chairman and CEO of the Ayala Corporation and also a top executive at Globe, BPI, Integrated Microelectronics, Inc., and many other corporations. I have been privileged to know him for over 30 years and to follow the transformation of Ayala, the oldest Philippine business group, from a 20th century group of business operations in automobiles, banking, food, electronics, real estate, and telecommunications into a much more diversified 21st century group that has added aviation, BPO, education, fintech, health, light rail, motorcycle assembly, power, tourism, and water. Ayala Corporation is also an investor outside the Philippines in Southeast Asia, and through IMI, it operates 22 factories in 10 countries. Ayala also has strong programs for culture and the community with the Ayala Foundation, Ayala Museum, and many more. Our guest speaker is co-vice chairman of the Makati Business Club, a valued partner of the Joint Foreign Chambers, and he contributes in a multitude of ways to our community, indeed, in the Philippines and Asia and elsewhere. One of the most important is his role as co-chair of the Philippine Disaster Resilience Foundation, which has worked tirelessly this year to deal with seemingly nonstop challenges, from the Taal eruption to COVID-19 feeding and testing, to typhoons Rolly and Ulysses, and now to speeding up vaccination. Thank you, Jaime, for the exemplary leadership from yourself and your family. And on behalf of the Joint Foreign Chambers, I also wish to thank BPI and Manila Water for being forum corporate sponsors for this and previous year. Jaime, please take the virtual podium to deliver your address.
John, a big thank you, John, for the very kind words, and thank you, John. You're the one that got me here, and deeply appreciate not only the friendship, but actually the leadership that you have given the Chambers, the AmCham, for more years than I can count now. It's always a pleasure to have you as a partner, and thank you for everything you do, John, both for the associations and for the country as well. To Secretary Mon Lopez, if he's here already, the many ambassadors who are here, a big thank you for this invitation. I understand we've got a number of the members of the Foreign Chamber of Commerce. Let me just mention their leaderships, Mr. Payne, the Canadian Chamber, Mr. Matsunaga-san, my good friend from the Japanese Chamber, Mr. Francis from the European Chamber, Mr. Hayden from the American Chamber, Mr. Alexander from the Australian New Zealand Chamber, and Mr. Lee from the Korean Chamber, and of course, Evelyn Nang from Pamuri. Thanks very much for inviting me to this great gathering. I can't think of a more important time to focus on foreign investment than now. All of you have been part and parcel of that, and just delighted to have this opportunity. Thank you again, John, for reaching out. As we've all seen and experienced, 2020 has been such a difficult year globally. The Annus Horribilis, first coined by Queen Elizabeth, would not be an overstatement. Locally, I think we've all lived through a catastrophic chain of challenges. A volcanic eruption, I think, at the start of the year, how we quickly forget that's the way we started the year, quickly followed by the worst health pandemic we've seen. And just, of course, as the year is coming to an end, we've had back-to-back super typhoons, and among the very worst that the world has seen this year. In the world of commerce, the sharp and extended deceleration in supply and demand, I think for all of us doing business here in the Philippines and in the region, has resulted in a massive drop in revenue flows across borders, thus creating significant fissures in our economic infrastructure, as well as our interconnectedness as a global and local community. And that whole breakdown, I guess, of interconnectedness, such a component nowadays of success of countries, nation states, and economies, is breaking apart in many ways. Yet bleak as it sounds in many ways, this crisis is also a turning point for change. In many ways, it has to be. It is also an opportunity for all of us to take action. It has been my privilege to see examples of heroism, resilience, and resoluteness in the last few months, reinforcing my belief in the inherent capacity of people to generally reinvent themselves in times of crisis, and of economies also to rebuild to new heights. So as you can see, I always remain an optimist in situations like this. Both the private and public sector, in my opinion, have equally important roles to play in our recovery, uniquely, but also collaboratively, like we demonstrated in the recent months with initiatives like Project Ugnayan, where we all work together, and Task Force T3. And we have continued to work hard at it through public-private partnerships to navigate this health and economic and humanitarian crisis, all of them in one grouping. Our future success requires a commonality of purpose between peers and partners, and progressive policies enacted by the public sector. Let me just break this down into two parts. First, allow me to address how we cope to create value as the Ayala Group of companies and encourage investment to the Philippines. We realize that we have our own role to play as a private institution, and happy to highlight what we're doing on our end. And second, allow me to put forward some key recommendations that we feel may support investments more broadly to our country that we all love and are dedicated to. Companies that exhibit a track record of reinvention and resilience, for starters, across multiple economic cycles, are better positioned to attract capital and investors. Of late, there is also a growing number of investors who demand a mindset of sustainability as a criterion for investing in a venture or a company. Of course, I speak of ESG, but also of sustainability in its broadest sense. Where to be successful over time, we need to commit to be adaptively relevant to changing consumer needs, and give a fair return on capital, and make a meaningful, positive impact to our local communities, and protect the environment for future generation. Much is expected of all of us these days in the private sector. During crises, we expect capital flight from higher risk places to lower risk destinations, usually from emerging economies to developed ones, from high growth ventures to stable, proven ones. After crises, that capital is prepared to take on higher risks as it seeks higher return multiples, albeit not necessarily returning back to the same ventures they fled. How might we weatherproof ourselves so that when capital is in search of attractive returns, it'll consider our shores here in the Philippines? How can we build to be more resilient and more sustainable? Some signs of a positive trajectory for the private sector can be gleaned from companies' successes in raising capital and the onboarding of new strategic investors or partners, even in difficult times. During this time of risk aversion, I'm comforted that the Ayala Group continued to attract strategic investments, with a significant part of it being foreign investments. In a broader sense, this is also an encouraging sign for all of you about and for the Philippine economy. Permit me just to share a couple of examples of how 2020 has evolved for us. The Ayala Group has taken advantage of the favorable debt market conditions during the crisis, and for this we thank our monetary authorities. Ayala Land, BPI, Globe, and Manila Water raised $3 billion in combined proceeds from the various domestic and international capital raising initiatives. In the last few months, Ayala Land had its initial public offering of the first real estate investment trust in the country with AREIT. We're very proud of that. Globe raised $300 million in the overseas bond market to fund Globe's network rollout, which includes aggressive building of cell sites, upgrading of all its sites to 4G LTE, and fast tracking of fiber rollout to Filipino homes nationwide. BPI on its own also raised 21.5 billion pesos in care bonds, the country's first peso-denominated bonds to be issued as a direct response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And finally, Manila Water raised $500 million in sustainability bonds. The issuance would support financing of important water and wastewater infrastructure projects in the communities in Manila Water's concession area, which is of course the eastern part of Metro Manila and the Rizal province. But still on the topic of access to capital markets, AC Energy recently completed the issuance of a $300 million fixed for life green bond to support the company's renewable expansion. This puts AC Energy's total green bond issuance at $1.17 billion, making it the largest green bond issuer in the Philippines and among the largest in Southeast Asia. In November, AC Energy also announced the potential investment of GIC, Singapore's sovereign wealth fund, into the company. GIC will acquire 17.5% ownership stake in AC Energy in a transaction valued at about 20 billion pesos. The strategic partnership and fresh capital will enable AC Energy to accelerate its expansion in renewable energy and its transition to a low carbon portfolio that pushes forward our commitment to our own ESG goals. Within the next 6 months, AC Energy plans to begin the construction of 1,500 megawatts or about $1.5 billion worth of renewable energy plants, including the 500 megawatt or $500 million based investment in the Philippines. We treat every peso raised with a strong sense of responsibility to our many shareholders and stakeholders who have been our partners throughout our company's growth journey. We also see it as an opportunity to supplement the critical public and private initiatives to address the COVID-19 crisis and its collateral damage to all of us. We recognize that the recovery in our country will not be the same for everyone. In fact, we already see today that while capital markets are open to large established institutions like ours, who thus have more options to endure the downturn, the drop in consumer demand has left many MSMEs in a more challenged position. Those already more vulnerable stand to become even more so in this environment. There is a clear and present risk of a bifurcation in recovery where inequalities widen in the country. The road ahead will not be easy or straightforward, but we believe that there are fundamental ways that we can support the recovery of our country, participating in a whole of society approach, and I think Secretary Mon Lopez has stated this also in the past. First, by effectively managing the health situation. Second, by increasing the ease of doing business. And third, by restoring and encouraging consumer confidence for all of us. Let me just run through these very briefly before closing. First, I think it's important for all of us, for both business recovery and consumer confidence, that we manage our health situation in the country. The private sector continues to work with government to ramp up the country's fight against COVID-19 through Task Force T3. It's the vehicle that we use. T3's initial mandate was to build up testing and treatment capacity. This has since expanded greatly to include data management, tracing, LGU training, and now citizen education on minimum health standards. Developments on the COVID-19 vaccine front is no doubt absolutely welcome news. You would have read the headlines over the weekend that the private sector also signed an advance purchase order for a supply of vaccines to be donated to the government, who will prioritize those most in need. Similar to Project Ugnayan, where 270 private companies quickly pooled resources to provide emergency food supplies to 14 million individuals, this initiative demonstrates the commitment and agility of the private sector to bridge the nation's emergency requirements, to give the government the time it needs to realign committed budgets and obtain the requisite approvals. This vaccine order is just but a first step. and one that gets us momentum on a fuller strategy that includes a multi-vaccine portfolio and a multi-year approach supported by a well-thought framework for supply and distribution. The procurement of vaccines and beyond that, the administration of a large-scale vaccination program will be one of the most important and challenging undertakings for the next few years. We believe this can only be done through a public-private partnership. Our commitment extends beyond our employees and their dependents to the community at large, prioritizing those most in need. Our task extends beyond procuring vaccines towards helping optimize the end-to-end supply chain and distribution logistics. All these things that address healthcare issues will go a long way to creating the kind of environment that we need for recovery. And I can't emphasize this enough. And while we're at it, I guess emphasis on our healthcare workers and building up that industry remains an absolute priority to remain competitive in the long term. Second, we support accelerating the many structural and policy reforms that have been ongoing for many years now. And for that, we're grateful to Secretary Mon Lopez for his continuous focus on this. We recognize and support the efforts of the government to improve the ease of doing business in the country. For instance, the improvements in the approval processes for permits and right-of-way acquisitions has allowed us to accelerate our investments and plan capital expenditures towards improving the country's telecommunication infrastructure. We're deeply grateful for the President's own mandate in making that happen. Such technology-driven and streamlined initiatives will not just ensure safety and continuity during emergencies, but it also increase the speed and efficiency in the new normal where internet connectivity moves from a nice-to-have luxury to an absolutely essential utility for all of us. Aside from fostering the ease of doing business, a second crucial piece is ensuring the predictability of policy and the regulatory environment. Business thrives, as we all know, in an environment where the rules are clear, consistent, and fairly applied. Enshrining stability and predictability, I believe, will set the Philippines alongside our peers when countries will compete for investments to boost the recovery in a post-COVID world. Third, allow me to spend some time to reinforce what many of us here already know, that restoring and encouraging a renewed sense of consumer confidence absolutely underpins any recovery. We're a consumer-driven society in the Philippines. More than firing up manufacturing and the supply side, we need to resuscitate demand. The Philippines has been among the hardest hit economies because we are among those who are most consumption-driven as an economy. Imagine the possibilities. 110 million educated, service-oriented, largely English-speaking and digitally fluent Filipinos make for a very attractive market, both locally and overseas. Unlocking that consumer demand is absolutely key to future success. For consumer demand to return, it is imperative that we create an environment where our fellow men feel safe, financially secure, and confident about the prospects in the future. There's so much psychology involved in this. We need to provide credibly safe environments in our workplaces, in our public transport systems, in the world of retail, commerce, and payments. In the last 9 months, we've surprised ourselves with what we can do despite mobility restrictions and while working largely from home. We have seen an exponential rise in digital banking, in online shopping, in electronic payments, in closing deals remotely and digitally, even big ticket ones like real estate purchases, and in digital distance learning. Many consumers and businesses have returned to remote, no-contact channels for doing their essential business. And many of those behaviors, habituated over the last 9 months, are absolutely here to stay. But at the risk of repeating the obvious, not all consumers, not all businesses have that luxury. And this brings me full circle to my earlier point on supporting recovery at all levels. For our recovery will be sustainable only if it lifts the tide across a broad base. We have a responsibility as institutions to widen our definition of who we are responsible for, beyond those who provide us capital and labor, and those within our traditional ecosystems of partners, clients, and customers. Beyond these, we are responsible for and accountable to our broader host communities. Let us continue to find ways as associations, as businesses, as public and private sector groups to collaborate, to multiply, not divide, and to commit to finding solutions to the critical pain points of society, including and especially the inequalities that may worsen as a result of the pandemic. I think all of us need to sacrifice short-term gains, as many private firms have already done, and short-lived comforts to focus on far-sighted solutions towards a recovery that allows us to remain relevant to the changing dynamics of this country. I have great faith in our organizations, certainly all of you chambers, in our country, and in our collective capacity to succeed as a community. May we all rise to the occasion as we seek new partnerships and work with public institutions and business groups, certainly such as the Foreign Chambers of Commerce, towards a more sustainable Philippines. If COVID-19 is what it had to take to stir us up and jolt us into this renewal, then this Annus Horribilis may yet usher in our Annus Mirabilis. We wish you a very successful 3-day summit. John, thank you again for the invitation, and I wish you all much success. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Zobel de Ayala, for that wonderful message. Indeed, all of us have a role to ensure that we achieve shared prosperity, and we must rebuild consumer confidence. And now to introduce our first keynote speaker, please welcome the President of the Japanese Chamber of Commerce and Industry of the Philippines, Mr. Keiichi Matsunaga.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished participants from the public and private sectors here in the Philippines and abroad. Good morning, magandang umaga, ohayo gozaimasu. Jaime-san, thank you very much for your inspiring speech, your consistent leadership in business, and the robust civic contributions of the many activities you lead. My name is Keiichi Matsunaga, President of the Japanese Chamber of Commerce and Industry of the Philippines, and the General Manager of Mitsubishi Corporation, Manila Branch. As you may know, Mitsubishi is a very large group of companies in Japan, much like Ayala Group in this country. In the interest of disclosure, Jaime-san is my boss, as Mitsubishi Corporation has invested in Ayala Corporation, and I sit on the board where Jaime-san is the chairman. I also head Mitsubishi Corporation's several other business investment companies in the Philippines. I am very privileged to serve as president of the Japanese Chamber of Commerce and Industry of the Philippines that has almost 700 members. Japanese firms have invested in a very wide range of business in this country for more than 100 years, both for the domestic and export markets. The Japanese Chamber and Mitsubishi Group strongly endorse the Philippines as a good investment destination and invite more foreign firms to invest. It is therefore a great honor for me to welcome and introduce a very special guest, the Secretary of the Department of Trade and Industry, Ramon Lopez. This is the first time that Secretary Lopez will speak at our annual forum, since he was unavailable in previous years, given our forum then was timed around the same period of the ASEAN and APEC summits. Secretary Lopez's insights are very important for our organization. It is also special for my Japanese and Korean colleagues because the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, was signed 2 weeks ago with the 15 members, representing the world's largest free trade agreement, in which Japan and Korea are members. And the Philippines played a key role because RCEP was initiated by ASEAN at the ASEAN Summit in 2012 in Cambodia. His role in the Philippine government's response to the COVID-19 has helped sustain business operations through DTI's measures and initiatives in addressing key issues. While the country was affected by the pandemic, we can observe trade focusing towards recovery and, more importantly, toward renewing the stability, predictability, and the much needed confidence of investors and business without compromising the safety and protection of workers. Mr. Secretary, in December 2010, the presidents of the Joint Foreign Chambers launched Arangkada Philippines with your predecessor, Secretary Domingo. For the Japanese and other foreign chambers, DTI is our mother department, meaning the agency of the Philippine government with which we work most closely and which is our champion when we have issues. DTI is also our partner when we share our successes in investment and trade. Mr. Secretary, we thank you for your message to our forum and your words, which I quote, despite the challenges of this year, the Philippines remains a conducive place to do business with its strong fundamentals brought about by many reforms in trade, investments, and financial reforms, among others. Our economy's resilience continues even as organizations such as the JFC continue to support our good governance initiatives, just as Arangkada translate to accelerate. Let us double our effort in driving the recovery of our economy toward the realization of our country's potential. This month is the 10th anniversary launching Arangkada. While there have been many important business and economic transformation over the past decades, the need for more reforms and more foreign investment is urgent to recover and grow beyond the effects of the pandemic. The economy may only regain pre-pandemic GDP and employment level in 2022, and foreign direct investment, or FDI, should contribute to the recovery. We are here today to learn more about what these reforms are so we can help advocate and implement them. The full biography of the secretary is in the souvenir program, but let me highlight that he has a very distinguished career in both the public and private sectors with the presidential management staff, DTI, and the NEDA, and with one of this country's largest food and beverage corporations. As a senior executive, he also developed and ran the impactful Go Negotiate program to support many thousands of Filipino entrepreneurs. With a solid professional economic, trade, and industry development career in various government agencies and extensive experience in the business sector, he was called to serve the country again in 2016. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Secretary Ramon Lopez.
Thank you very much, Matsunaga-san. Hello also to Ms. Monet Iturralde Hamlin, and hello also to Jaime Jasa-san, Mr. John Forbes, Mr. Ed Hincliffe, Mr. Julian Payne, Mr. Nabil Francis, Mr. Kaushik Das, Dr. Ronald Mendoza, Professor Victor Andres Manhit. Hello to all our friends, and of course, to everyone out there, ladies and gentlemen, magandang umaga po sa inyong lahat. The country's new investment promotion brand, Make It Happen in the Philippines, is more than just a brand or a tagline. It speaks of who we are as Filipinos and as government. It highlights our genuine Filipino trait of resilience and make it work mindset that exudes strength and adaptability even in times of adversity. The success of our repurposing manufacturing program is a testament to this mindset. It demonstrates the agility of Philippine industries to adapt to changing business environments anchored on the country's growing industrial baselines and the ability to leverage a broader ecosystem or inter and intra-industry partnerships. From a production capacity of 6 million pieces of surgical masks per month and none for coveralls pre-COVID, we were able to ramp up our production in domestic capacity to over 60 million medical-grade face masks, and from nothing to zero, from zero to 3.2 million pieces of medical-grade coveralls per month. Together, we made it happen. Make it happen in the Philippines is also a promise to Filipinos and anyone doing or wants to do business in or with the Philippines that we will build back better. That is why we set out to implement Rebuild, our initiative, which stands for revitalizing businesses, investments, livelihoods, and domestic demand. This is our economy recovery plan amidst the pandemic and is anchored on a vision to create a modern, dynamic, and responsible Philippines as envisioned by our President Rodrigo Roa Duterte. It is aimed at jump-starting and reinvigorating the Philippine economy by revitalizing consumption and enhancing production capacity. The two broad strategies of Rebuild are to revitalize demand and empower local industries to capture the demand in the agriculture, industry, and services. On the demand side, it starts with government support via economic stimulus to save the companies to keep jobs. This is important to attract more production activities and create better business environment for investments. On the supply side, we should enhance production capacities in agriculture, industry, and services sectors to help build our export competitiveness and manage imports. This creates a dynamic cycle of sustained and growing economic activity with strong domestic linkages. Hence, the infusion of more foreign direct investments plays a dual critical role in our country's economic development. It addresses the supply chain gaps in production, and it also provides for the physical and digital infrastructure to enable the modernization of Philippine industries. Rebuilding the robust growth of Philippines will start from the strategies outlined under the Rebuild Initiative. This will hinge on key drivers that have enabled Philippine economy to thrive in previous years. With a stable and large domestic market of 110 million people, our population is expected to grow by 16.8% from 2017 to 2026. We are in a demographic sweet spot with the average age of Filipinos being 24 years old, which means significant latent demand for goods and services in the country. The Philippines also has preferential access in major markets through our free trade and preferential trade arrangements with ASEAN, Japan, Korea, China, India, Australia, New Zealand, the EU, EFTA, Russia, US, and Canada. The recent conclusion of the Regional Mega Free Trade Agreement, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, otherwise known as RCEP, is further expected to strengthen the Philippine advantage. This agreement signals a renewed vow in a rules-based system for trade and investments in the region and with our key trade partners, ASEAN with Australia, China, Japan, Korea, and New Zealand. It covers not only the usual areas of trade in goods and services, investment and economic cooperation, but also emerging trade areas such as intellectual property, e-commerce, government procurement, and competition. Moreover, the country has been a reliable manufacturing base for export-oriented industries. The Philippines has veered away from the imposition of export restrictions, even for critical medical products, even during the height of the pandemic. Instead, we capacitate manufacturing firms to enable them to support both domestic and foreign demand. As a testament of our Make It Happen brand, we have a large pool of skilled, trainable, and cost-efficient workforce who are also competent, hardworking, and loyal. Among the ASEAN member states, the Philippines produce among the highest number of tertiary graduates, most of which are into engineering, IT-related fields, medicine, health-related fields, and agri-forestry. Prior to the pandemic, the Philippines had very strong economic fundamentals. We were growing at an average of 6.6% over the period of 2016 to 2019. The Philippines was also the third fastest growing economy in Asia. In 2019, our per capita GDP stood at $3,400 to $3,500, and we were projecting to reach the $4,000 mark to become an upper middle income by 2020 if COVID-19 did not happen. Our astute monetary policy enabled us to have low and stable inflation rates, averaging at 2.5% in 2019. Last year, we had a strong fiscal position whereby we achieved highest revenues and lowest debt as shares of GDP. We also had among our lowest unemployment and underemployment rates in 2019, down to about 5%. And we even received the highest ever credit ratings in the range of BBB+ to A- from credit ratings agencies. Because of COVID-19, lives were lost, the health of many of our people suffered, livelihoods were affected, and the dream of many were put on hold. We owe it to our people, every Filipino and every investor who has put their trust and faith in the Philippines to rebuild a better economy. We will make it happen. With the passing of the Create Bill, we expect more great things for the country to happen. The Philippines is working on a V-shaped economic recovery. We expect to sustain this towards the end of the year and look forward to a stronger recovery in 2021. Moody's recently recalibrated our GDP forecast for our country to a robust 7.8% for 2021 instead of the original 5.2% projection. Our export performance, after dropping by half in April of this year, is already better than last year at positive 2% growth rate by September, driven by increase in the exports of copper and other mineral products, chemicals, and electronic products. Furthermore, our net foreign direct investments went up from 41% as of July to 47% last August, and this has been growing for 4 consecutive months. The country is also lining up the production of 10 new vehicle models even in the midst of pandemic. In DTI, we recorded a 12% increase in the number of business names registered for the first 8 months of the year compared to the full year of 2019. Online businesses registered leapfrog from 1,700 in March to 87,000 by November. This is a clear indication of the adaptability of Filipinos in challenging times. The investment approvals registered by Philippine Board of Investment is on track to hit 1 trillion peso level for the year, and it will be the second highest mark in the agency's history. For the first 3 quarters of 2020, our investment approvals already reached over $15 billion. Our Philippine Economic Zone Authority, BEZA, has also registered a 43% increase in investments in our export-oriented IT BPM industry. There are 90 notable investment leads with high probability of completion, valued at about $24 billion, about to generate 134,800 jobs. There are also 73 more target investment leads that DTI will invite directly, coming from the US, Malaysia, Japan, China, Taiwan, Europe, and Japan. Yes, we also would like to point out that the Philippines has risen in the Global Innovation Index 2020 to 50th out of the 131 countries from 54th place in 2019. This is the first time that the Philippines has reached the top 50. Moreover, the GII recognizes the country as an innovation achiever for the second year in a row. From 2014, we were just in the 100s, and now we are in the 50th rank. We think our next target of 43rd rank is achievable, and we are committed to achieve this goal. Just recently, our country got a much-needed boost as we are ranked among the safest economies in the world. The Philippines placed 12th among the 50 countries based on the highly respected Gallup's 2020 Global Law and Order Report. It's worth noting that we are at the same level as Australia and New Zealand. As such, foreign investors would surely take notice of this development and take advantage of the potential opportunities in the country. We look forward to the virus being contained, along with our fiscal support reawakening to revitalize and bolster our economy. As we promote our country in the face of expected global recovery, we can tap the emerging opportunities and challenges from shifting trade and investment preferences and changing forms of international production. This will be made possible as we continue to fast-track our industrial strategies with reskilling and upskilling of our workforce, along with adopting new technologies. With a more resilient, inclusive, and sustainable effort, we are gearing up for a dramatic recovery next year. Our ultimate goal is that with your support, our country's economic growth story will continue even better in the post-COVID future. Through the jobs and employment generated by business and investments, our people can gain a better and more comfortable quality of life, as promised by our President, Rodrigo Roa Duterte. We are confident that as we launch also the Make It Happen in the Philippines campaign, we relay a clear message across the world that Philippines is dynamic, agile, and resilient. Now more than ever, we are ready to roll up our sleeves and make things happen for you. Thank you again to everyone, and let's make it happen in the Philippines. Salamat po at magandang umaga sa inyong lahat.
We are very grateful and honored, Secretary Lopez. Thank you so much for joining us this morning and for giving us that wonderful, uplifting and optimistic keynote speech. We really all want to have the dramatic recovery and to make it happen here in the Philippines. And now to introduce our guest speaker and the panel entitled Picturing the New Normal in the Philippines and Asia, we have with us the President of the European Chamber of Commerce of the Philippines, Mr. Nabil Francis.
Bonjour. Nabil Francis, I'm the President of the European Chamber of Commerce, representing a region of nearly 500 million people, and this without counting Russia, Turkey, and the Caucasus region. Our chamber has about 750 members, including mostly European and Filipino companies. In my day job, I'm the president of Republic Cement, a part of the Aboitiz Group. I have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker, who is joining us from Singapore. He's the managing partner of McKinsey Company, Southeast Asia, Mr. Kaushik Das. McKinsey Company is a nearly a century-old American company, well known as the world leader in management consulting. Mr. Das has worked in most of the Asian countries in a wide variety of industry. We are most pleased he accepted our invitation. Singapore, the regional hub for multinational firms, is the perfect place to observe Southeast Asia. When we were planning this forum, we became aware of McKinsey project called The Future of Asia, which analyzed how Asia is moving from rising to having arrived and soon to more advanced levels during the Asian century. Mr. Das will address the topic of panel 1, picturing the new normal in the Philippines and Asia. We certainly hope the new normal will not be what we are living through today. We would like our future to be better, new post-pandemic normal with the elements of McKinsey's The Future of Asia and reforms based on lessons learned from the pandemic, following rallying crises such as never waste a good crisis and build back better. One question we hope Mr. Das and the panel will answer is, what is the significance of the Philippines dropping from fastest growing of the Asian six to the highest negative GDP of the group, while Vietnam, with positive GDP growth this year, is overtaking the Philippines in per capita income? The Philippines is already a strong exporter of services, with foreign firms employing 1.3 million English-speaking Filipinos. Meanwhile, numerous reports indicate that Vietnam is rapidly industrializing, with foreign investment on a scale unachieved in the Philippines. Vietnam has organized its agricultural sector to be extremely successful in food exports without foreign investments. What are the missing ingredients required for the Philippine economy to industrialize, as well as to raise agriculture productions to the levels of Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam, and to build a less remittance-dependent economy? After his speech, we invite Mr. Das to join the panel with 3 experts who can comment insightfully on how they see the new normal. They are Mr. Hans Friens, also from Singapore, who is currently the managing director of Friends Partner, a leading regional government affairs firms with office through Asia. Dr. Donald Mendoza, Dean of the School of Government at the Ateneo Manila University, and previously Director of the AIM Washington DC Policy Center. And Professor Victor Andres Dindo Manhit, who heads Stratbase at the ADR Institute, whom we congratulate for organizing the 5-day Filipinas conference last week, discussing issues similar to ours. Moderating the panel is Mr. Patrick Cook, Regional Editor of For Asia with the Oxford Business Group, who moderated a panel at our forum last year. I would also like to remind the participants of our very interesting midday breakout sessions. At noon, Ansrian and Friends Partner country managers will discuss Asians happening, as well as Paulo Mercado will speak about creative industries. At 12:45, Ray Untel of IBPAP and Dan Lashik of SAP will discuss their industries, which are vital to the employment and to the Philippines economy. Also at 12:45, Ana Reyes Morales, a Filipina photojournalist, whose photos grace the cover of National Geographic magazine, will have a talk. Please register for each breakout session you wish to attend. You may also register for more than one. We extend a warm welcome to our speaker, panelists, and moderators, and look forward to what they will explain about the lessons of our present situations, as well as what we can expect in the future. I now give the time to Mr. Das to deliver his remarks and later join the panel discussion.
Good morning, Mr. Francis. Thank you for the welcome, and good morning, everybody. I'm Kaushik Das. I lead McKinsey & Company across Southeast Asia, and I've had the privilege of working in Philippines over the years, as also many other countries in the region. Thank you very much for having me here today. What I'll do over the next 20 minutes is I'll give you a bit of a snapshot of our research around the impact of COVID in Philippines and in other ASEAN countries. I'll talk a little bit about our research around the future of Asia, both pre-COVID and post-COVID, and maybe finish with a few thoughts on implications for Philippines, where Philippines could actually maybe benefit from some of the trends that we are seeing, some of the economic trends that we are seeing. And then I'm very happy to take some questions or to take those questions over the panel as you would guide us. Let me start by sharing some of our pages, from our research. I'll share some of our slides as well, if you allow. Let's just get that organized. Good. All right. Do you all see this cover page that talks about picturing the new normal? So what I'll do, I'll do three things here today. First of all, I'll touch on COVID-19 and its impact. Along with that, I'll talk about where Asia might have been headed. Then we'll get into what do you do about the future? What are some of the trends? And then we'll talk about implications for Philippines, right? So we'll take it in that order. So let's look at the impact of COVID. From our perspective, we've spent a lot of time, as you can imagine, researching the impact of COVID on our economies, also in working with many of our governments around the world on COVID. In fact, in the Philippines, I think we've had the privilege of working with several of the private sector companies. In fact, many of you who are on this conference today in helping mitigate some of the impact of COVID. And I have to say the private sector has really teamed, in Philippines in particular. I think the private sector's role in teaming up with the government to help on COVID has been really inspiring. Across ASEAN, it's one of the best examples that we've seen of private-public partnership. Now, having said that, what are the potential scenarios, the economic scenarios? We actually ran 9 models around economic scenarios. On the vertical axis here, you see the progress on health, the healthcare side of things, which is, would COVID just go away? Would it come back? Would there be multiple rounds of COVID? So right on top, you see effective control of the virus, which is 2 to 3 months of lockdown, and then life returning to some modicum of normalcy. As we go down, the middle option, the middle row, talks about multiple rebounds of the virus, which is actually the reality of what we are seeing in Philippines and most ASEAN countries. There is a second wave, or in some places a third wave. Thailand and Vietnam are potentially exceptions to that, but Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia have seen resurgence, so they would be in the second row. And then there is a third row where the virus is completely out of control. On the x-axis here, we've modeled interventions by governments, and as in Philippines' case, the private sector playing a role. So on the right side, we've modeled highly effective interventions, and there are 2 parts to this. It's not just the amount of money that's funneled in. There has been unprecedented amount of money being funneled in, but also does that money reach vulnerable sections of the population, the population that actually needs help. I think in most of our ASEAN countries, we are in the second column here, where there are partially effective interventions. So, we've done a lot of modeling around how much money is funneled in, but how much actually gets used, how much actually makes its way to people that need the money. And then, the first column talks about ineffective interventions. If you look at the sentiments of our corporate executives, they're in the three buckets in the middle that we've colored out. In fact, if you just go to the next page, you will see we've actually been running surveys of executives every month to see where do people think that they're headed. And this is the latest in terms of corporate sentiments. Most people think we're going to be right in the middle, where there will be some muddling, middle term situation where the virus does keep coming back. We have to be wary, but governments aren't giving up. Governments are at it. And people would say this is a little bit different from some of our, the Western countries, which probably have been hit harder. Now, what does this mean for the Philippines? On the next page, what we'll show you our model for the Philippines. And look, nobody quite knows, right? Where we're going to be headed. There's no crystal ball out there. But our thinking at this moment is the Philippines on the potentially the most likely scenario, which is the A1 scenario, is probably going to get back to normal GDP in Q4 of 2021. But there are also scenarios that would say that it can really slip out and go all the way till the end of 2022. Now, if you compare this to the rest of ASEAN, and you get a picture of how you're doing here, Philippines is on the green line. Okay, so Philippines is the green line. You'll see across ASEAN is quite a different set of pictures. So on one end, we've got Vietnam, which has been spared the worst of the crisis, but also Vietnam has Vietnam and Indonesia have amongst the most domestically oriented economies, least dependent on travel, least dependent on external inflows. And so in A1, so let's just focus on the A1 scenario. We actually see them coming through or recovering, the earliest. In fact, Vietnam is already back to pre-COVID situation. Whereas some of the economies that are most dependent on external inflows, travel, etc., will probably take the longest. So look, that's a bit of a snapshot around, what might happen now. If you just, so what are the themes here? The scale of disruption is huge. I mean, if you look at Philippines back in April, you had about 7 million people, workers, were displaced in some shape or form. Now that's improved significantly. That 7 million is now down to some 4.5 million workers. But the scale of disruption is huge. We do think at the same time that there are lots of pre-COVID trends that are accelerating, digitalization, etc. And therefore people that were already strong in some of the pre-COVID areas, they'll probably emerge stronger. They could emerge stronger. But if you don't make changes now to adapt, you could actually potentially emerge weaker as well. I mean, one of the things we are seeing in today's world is that the winners win big and the losers lose, unfortunately, really badly. The Philippines can actually win. I mean, I'll show you some data. We actually feel quite confident that the Philippines the Philippines can come out well from this. This will take multiple stages. There isn't, unfortunately, one quick shot, solution to everything. There will be uncertainty, and governments have to prepare their populations for the degree of uncertainty around here. There will be a long tunnel, but hopefully there will be a somewhat different world at the end of that tunnel. Now, what are some of the specifics? Let me just move back from COVID to remind ourselves of some of the pre-COVID, things. So let's look at some of the numbers. I'll just remind you of some of the numbers more broadly around Asia, and then we'll come down to the Philippines. I mean, Asia today, roughly 2 billion people, roughly 28% of global consumption, accounting for about 40% of the world's GDP. This is set to change. This is changing rapidly. In about 20 years, we'll be 40% of the world's consumption, and we will be more than 50% of the world's GDP. And in a sense, this is a return to the way the world was about 150 years ago. So it's not really a surprise. But Asia is going to be a key player in the world's economy. The other thing I'm going to highlight, which might surprise people, is while Asia is growing, intra-Asia is actually going to be very important. Intra-Asia is going to be even more important than, cross-continental stuff. Just, a couple of factoids around this. If you look at global trade's been growing, if you go back over 20 years, at about we've seen about, 2.8x growth. Though in the last couple of years, global trade's really stopped growing. But if you look at intra-regional trade, within Asia or even within ASEAN, China, that trade's been growing much faster, 4x at the same period, over this period of time. And it has continued to grow over the last couple of years. So one of the things is, there is a world out there, but then there is a world that we can make. There is a world that we live in. And this part of the world that we live in, that we have the fortune of living in, is a good part of the world. And there are opportunities in this part of the world. Now, what's happened is lots of things have accelerated as a result of COVID. So if you just look at, we looked at some of the metrics, just telemedicine, which was really a big Chinese phenomenon and was not really, that big across ASEAN. You've seen 10x growth in subscribers, and that happened over 15, 20 days in the early days of COVID. Remote working, we are experiencing it now. We are doing this over Zoom. Remote learning, some of the valuations for tech companies in remote learning in India, in ASEAN, have really accelerated. Online entertainment, and Philippines actually plays a role here. Online delivery and logistics, they've skyrocketed. If you look at Philippines in particular, we looked at, Philippines does have a few strengths. The 34 tech hubs in the Philippines, loosely called tech hubs in the Philippines. The Philippines is a strong participant in both in intra-regional trade as well as in intellectual property. Thanks to the offshoring that's happened, thanks to lots of remote services being provided, there are good starting points in our country. If you look at some of the changes in consumers, we've been running consumer surveys in the Philippines. We've seen quite significant changes in behavior. Now, some of this you would expect, but there are things here that are surprising. One of the things that surprised us is optimism. Optimism is bifurcating. There is a class of society which has found a way to cope with COVID, which has found a way to cope with some of the changes, and they're actually okay. But there is a class of society in the Philippines in particular that is not quite able to cope, and they're not feeling optimistic. So there is a bifurcation. While we talk about trends, this is something that's very important for corporate leaders as well as for the country leaders. Optimism is bifurcating. Flight to quality, which is something we're seeing in common across many of our countries. Whether it's investment, whether it's purchasing goods, whether it's purchasing luxury goods, medicines, healthcare services, flight to quality. Another thing that surprised us in the Philippines, grocery baskets localizing. Maybe it's partly driven by people's inability to travel. So you go to places nearby, but also people are preferring goods often that are more local. So so there's a whole bunch of things that are happening. Some in common with the rest of ASEAN, but some quite uniquely Filipino in some ways. So the next page. You see we do see Filipino consumers much more willing to experiment with digital technologies than they have been in the past. This is probably not a surprise, but whether it's mobile banking, online banking, etc., just net much more willingness to experiment and to step out of their comfort zone. So net, where therefore, what's the big picture? I'm sorry, I'm rushing through a lot of details, but I'm very happy to take more questions if you have as we get through this. What's the future going to be? We see a lot of debate around where will the world come out, when we come out of this tunnel. There are people that say there'll be a hyper-localized world. There'll be a much more localized world. There'll be a much more localized Asia, an Asia that turns inwards, reflecting on what might have happened in the US, where there are geopolitical tensions, where governments are focused on security of health, security of supply, security of food, and therefore it's all about more local growth. Self-sufficiency takes over. There are people that talk about but we'll have a hyper globalized world where remote working is fine, technology is omnipresent. A lot of people say, you take a country like Singapore, people have gotten used to working from remote, including not meeting, colleagues. Why will the next class of white collar work get offshore and outsourced? And cannot countries like Philippines benefit from that? So there could be a hyper globalized world where people are just working much more remote, using much more technology, and Filipinos can actually benefit. Where we actually think is neither of the extreme scenarios will actually happen. We think we'll come out at what we call an accelerated future. Some of existing trends will move faster. Digital use will indeed go up, etc. But the world will get to where it was heading to. It will get there much faster. But we don't think radical change of either extreme situation is going to happen. We do think that there are a few things for governments to be very, very careful about. There is displacement, both emotionally, mentally, and also in real life for a lot of people. And governments have to be thoughtful about this, reskilling people, retraining people, building capability, not just for individuals, but also for SMEs, micro SMEs, very important. There will be more regionalization. How do you build new networks instead of just looking afar, looking to the west? How do you build new networks in your own neighborhood? So there will be some changes. But that's the accelerated future. I'm very conscious of time, so I'm quickly jump into Philippines and how Philippines might be positioned in all of this. Again, let me just back us up a little bit, as I talk about the future of Philippines. If you go to the next page, we ran some research, about a year ago, looking at long-term performance of economies. So we looked at about 70 countries, and we looked at 50-year performance, 30-year performance, which countries have been doing better, which not. And if you look at this map, there were many ASEAN countries that over a 50-year time frame, starting from 65, have been what we call long-term outperformers. Here we use the US as a benchmark. So if you take the US as the median, which countries have done better or worse over 50 years, 30 years, 20 years, etc. Unfortunately, the Philippines did not show up in the long-term performance, outperformers. It did not show up in what we call the recent outperformers, i.e. the last 20 years. And that was a little bit disappointing. But on the positive side, if you look at very recent accelerators, so we look at the last 5 years, the last 10 years, we see the Philippines economy both doing well and being far less volatile than many other countries, many of your other neighbors, despite changes in the political context. And that gives us hope. And in fact, when we then projected this to the future, the next page, we actually think that the Philippines is actually well set for the next few years. We actually don't think that the Philippines, we actually think that the Philippines is well set for the next few years. So if you look at this page, if you look at, we tried to predict, how much growth is going to be there between now and 2013, between 2015 and 2030. Actually, Philippines is going to contribute a very significant part of ASEAN growth. Second only to Indonesia, which is a much larger country than yours. So there is reason for feeling positive about the Philippines. The past may have been a little bit, how do I put it, sleepy, but Philippines is catching up, and there is good hope for the future. I'm very conscious of time, so I'm going to jump a few things, jump a few pages. If you go to, we'll go to page number 22, and I'd like to show you, there are a few secular trends, pre-COVID and then accelerated because of geopolitics. One of them is lots of manufacturing companies are moving out of China or are diversifying their manufacturing base out of China. This is for pre-COVID reasons and then geopolitical reasons of the last couple of years and the geopolitical tensions. But even if you go back to pre-COVID, actually, China's labor costs used to be 1/40th that of Japan 20 years ago. They are now 1/4, so still better, but the gap has narrowed. So people are looking elsewhere. And then geopolitics kind of comes in. Now, a lot of these are, however, a lot of these opportunities are going to Vietnam, they're going to Cambodia, they're going to Bangladesh. They're not really coming to Philippines. The question is, can the Philippines step up? Can the larger ASEAN countries, can Indonesia step up? Can Philippines step up? And can we capture a larger share of the pie here? Let me jump by a couple of pages and show you three themes, I think, for the Philippines. One is, of course, at the beginning, how do you increase the country's resilience? There are some areas exposed by the crisis. How do you increase the country's resilience? Second is, there are opportunities that will come as a result of what's happening around us today. How can we better prepare to capture those opportunities? And then how can we put in place the right enablers? I mean, these are three themes, if you can just kind of keep them in your mind as we look at the next page. The opportunities, we kind of group them around 5 areas. There is digitalization. Now, we all know this. We are all aware of the changing consumer, which I'll talk about again in a minute. Where we see not enough focus maybe is the use of technology on the business side, ironically, on the business side, particularly with small businesses, SMEs, micro SMEs, industry 4.0 rather than the fancy consumer technologies. How do you leverage those? How do you build capability with your companies, medium-sized, smaller-sized companies around these technologies? Singapore is actually doing some very interesting things here around building capability of their SMEs, working with the business federations, working with the private sector. Are there things that you could learn? Of course, growth of e-commerce, e-services, etc. How do you ride that? But there is a lot of initiative in that space already. How do you benefit from international flows? Remember the chart I showed you about companies diversifying from China, but not thinking about Philippines. But Philippines could and should. Philippines has a very educated workforce. How do you drive productivity? How do you drive training? But how do you make Philippines part of global supply chains as they shift? How do you ensure that there is flow of R&D services, etc. Come into the Philippines? The third big theme is around the consumers. Consumers are, there is a flight to quality, which I mentioned earlier. There is, increased focus on localization. How do we benefit from there? But also, people are more thoughtful about healthcare, about resilience, about security. How do you drive that? We do think ESG, so environment and sustainability goals. A lot of people think, and governance, environment, but a lot of people think that the COVID has actually pushed back some of the aspirations around the environment and sustainability. That may be true in some areas. For example, the use of single-use plastic. But we think this is going to come back, and we think that there is a lot of potential here to benefit. The Philippines has been a leader in geothermal. The Philippines has wind energy. The Philippines deregulated its energy sector well ahead of ASEAN. The question is, how do you take that forward and really benefit? How do you experiment? The Philippines still has, we were having a discussion yesterday, has much less distributed solar energy than many of the other countries around. So, how do you expand on that? And then frankly, the future of work. How do you prepare your workers? How do you prepare your people for the future? How do you build capability? How do you train people that are displaced? Now, I did talk about displacement. What I didn't mention is that we expect technology will also create a lot more new jobs in the Philippines. I think we've got various estimates of somewhere between 10 and 14 million new jobs over the next 10 years. How do you prepare your people for that? Let me actually let me show you one final page, and then I'll pause, or maybe 2 pages. So this is just a set, a feel for the kind of changes that are coming down to the Philippines. This is Philippines specific data. We went through sector by sector in the Philippines to look at just existing technology. How much of the jobs in these sectors could get displaced? What's the potential today? This is existing technologies today. And you can see pretty significant number of workers in each of these sectors can get affected or will get affected, are likely to get affected. But at the same time, the good news is, we think tens of millions of jobs can be created too as a result of this displacement. You just need to get ahead in preparing your workers, preparing your SMEs. So let me just finish with the final kind of page. Keep three words in mind: speed. Things are changing much faster than before. Remember, I talked about 10x speed of change. Collaboration. We actually think the private sector, the academic sector will play a very important role. This is not the situation we are in today is not going to get addressed by governments alone or by private sector alone, for that matter. There needs to be partnership. And again, we think the COVID response, from several of your leading companies is a role model. How do you take that forward? And then resilience. How do you prepare your populations for resilience? On that note, thank you very much for having me today. And I look forward to continued discussion on these topics.
Thank you very much to our guest speaker, Mr. Kaushik Das. Thank you so much. Those are very interesting scenarios that you shared with us and what we can look forward to if we all work together. Please remain on stream, Mr. Das, so that we can join the panel discussion. To moderate this esteemed panel, may we call on the Regional Director for Asia of the Oxford Business Group, Mr. Patrick Cook. Joining in this panel is also the founder and managing partner, Vriens and Partners from Singapore, Mr. Hans Vriens. Next, we have the Dean of the School of Government, Ateneo de Manila University, Dr. Ronald Mendoza. And to complete the panel, we have the founder and the managing director of Strat-Based Group, also the president of Albert Del Rosario Institute for Strategic and International Studies, Professor Victor Andres Dindo Manhit. Over to you, Mr. Cook.
Thank you, Monette, and thank you, Kaushik, for that very interesting presentation that's really laid some good foundations for this discussion today. And greetings to everyone and welcome to this first panel discussion of the event. I'm speaking to you from Dubai, so it's a bit earlier for me in the morning, but I'm feeling very energized by some of the topics discussed already. So we have 45 minutes for the discussion with the panelists, and then after that, or maybe even during that, we have 15 minutes for audience questions. So please, as you're listening, feel free to share your questions with us and we'll make sure we make enough time to cover everything. And with it being such a diverse panel with interesting topics to discuss, I'd like to waste no more time by going straight into the first question. Hans, you approached this discussion from a regional perspective. And the presentation by Mr. Das covered some different scenarios for the recovery in the Philippines and ASEAN. So I'd like to turn it on you. What's your perspective on the prospects for recovery in the Philippines relative to other ASEAN states? And to what extent do you think the new normal, which is the theme of this discussion, in the Philippines will resemble the new normal elsewhere in emerging Asia?
Wow, perfect. Thanks for that. Some big questions. First of all, what we see, our focus is very much on Southeast Asia. We have offices all around ASEAN. So what we see, of course, that countries are already more back to normal, that have been able to in their domestic economies. I mean, if you go to Vietnam, people no longer wear masks. There's no social distancing. Everything seems back to normal, with the exception of air travel. There are virtually no flights in outside Vietnam. Same, more or less, in no tourists, by the way. Same in Thailand, to a lesser extent, the same in Singapore. I'm talking from our office, but not, of course, the exceptions are really the Philippines, Indonesia. And as a result of that, if you're still in the middle of a quasi or full lockdown, it's going to take a much longer to fully recover. But having said that, after that, once we start recovering, I totally agree with the interesting observations Kaushik made. It's going to be very different, and there are fantastic opportunities, especially with so many companies and factories leaving China. I mean, look at the ability of Vietnam. Vietnam is only the size of one Chinese province. They can never absorb all the factories that are looking for a place outside China. So there are great opportunities also for the Philippines, as long as it gets its government policies right and are really able and focused on attracting those factories. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to come back a little bit later in the discussion on this topic on the relocation from China. But at this point, I'd like to bring in Dindo. Hans made an interesting point there about how countries like Thailand and Vietnam have managed to normalize life a lot quicker than the Philippines. Obviously, restrictions have eased in the Philippines through the year, but we still see Metro Manila and other urban areas on general community quarantine, at least until the end of the year. So prior to the rollout of an effective vaccine, what more do you think could be done at the policy level to safely ease restrictions in the Philippines and hopefully open up more of those service industries that are so vital to the GDP in the country and also to job creation?
Hi, Patrick. Good morning to everyone. I hope I can be heard. Good. Yep. Of course, 8 months since our lockdown, and we continue to face this public health crisis with its economic consequence already. And part of that is really this long lockdown that affected jobs, livelihood in the country right now. And what we have failed to do really is that we have failed to see it from, can we turn crisis into an opportunity? We've seen too much focused on really approaching it as a health crisis alone. And we even approach it from a highly securitized approach, means the use of the coercive forces of the state. And that for me lacks really the more strategic thinking. And that's the more strategic thinking is as what Mr. Hans mentioned earlier, there's a lot of opportunities that we can see from investments coming out of China. And I would like even to add the new southern policy of South Korea, or the southbound policy of Taiwan, whereby they're looking at ASEAN as an opportunity. And we're the closest among these ASEAN countries. And we see even the new policy that was started by the Abe government, continued by the Suga government with regards to moving out of China. But what we need to look at it is that this long emergency that we expect to deal with can be best addressed if we will approach it not only in trying to recover and bring about, again, a stronger service economy, but also maybe an opportunity to look at our manufacturing sector. Look at one that is not consumption-driven growth, but more of investment-led growth. That means how can government really create the environment for investment by both local and foreign investors and really generate the jobs and the livelihood opportunities that our people need as we recover from this pandemic. And that means looking at policies that can really improve this. We have heard of amendments to the Public Service Act, amendments to the Foreign Investment Act. These are all opportunities that can create more interest in the Philippines, and we can best compete their ASEAN neighbors.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you, Dindo. Now, Ron, at this point, I'd like to bring in you. We had some discussions before this panel today, and just on some of your focus areas at the moment. And you highlighted to me that the relatively small counter-COVID stimulus in the Philippines is perhaps one of the reasons behind the deep economic contraction that was mentioned earlier. And certainly when we compare this to Malaysia and Thailand, the public stimulus in the Philippines has been relatively small, and actually public spending has been falling over recent months as the government has actually been tightening its belt after the peak pandemic days. So as we look towards 2021, where would you like to see more targeted government spending, both to kickstart economic recovery and perhaps tackle some of the widening inequality that I know that you're concerned about?
Yes, thank you so much, Patrick. I think really the pandemic deserves at least part of the response should be focused on the health sector. And I think the reality for the country after over 260 days of lockdown is that we don't necessarily have more confidence in our health sector now than we did when we started this entire odyssey in March 15, when we started the first lockdown phase. Just the other week, we had our government approve the export of labor of health professionals again, around 5,000 a year. which to me at least raises the issue of whether we have enough here in the country to actually meet potential demand for health professionals. And I think anyone you talk to here in the Philippines, the quick answer will be that we can use every single health professional we have to actually answer the health demand even pre-COVID. So it's unclear to me why some of these policies are again being lifted, and why, as Professor Manhit didn't mention, why don't we think of this as an opportunity to boost our health sector, invest in our health sector, and actually prevent more of an unequalizing response to the crisis. As I wrote in several articles, I think crises can be inequality machines. In the education sector, some of our kids can go to school online. Many do not have access to computers and the internet. In the health sector, some of us have good health insurance. Many workers don't even have any form of insurance. Some of us can work from home, like what we're doing right now. Many of our workers do not have that option. So I think those are the key issues that we need to think about and act on and invest in order to come out of this stronger.
Okay, and now Kaushik, I'd like to bring you in after your very interesting speech for your first question of the panel. And one of the many interesting things you highlighted was the prospects of an accelerated future being the most likely outcome from this pandemic, or in the post-pandemic world. If we look at the Philippines, is there a risk that a country like this could be left behind in this accelerated future if you take into account the digital divide within the country, the problems in expanding digital infrastructure and access? And what more can be done to ensure that this accelerated future is also applicable to the Philippines and not just countries like Singapore and South Korea, for example?
Patrick, that's a very good question. And you're right that in today's digital world, which I touched on this briefly, winners win bigger than before and losers lose worse than before. And it does create an interesting set of dynamics. You've got to work to get yourself in the right half. We are seeing that in the corporate sector. We do see that more broadly socially as well. Now, I would say that there are lots of things that should give us hope for the Philippines. Lots of things that should give us hope. As I mentioned, while if you take a long past look at the Philippines was behind other ASEAN countries. There is momentum in recent years. There is momentum, and this is a political momentum. There have been different administrations, etc. But the Philippines economy has continued to perform and perform well, and that should give us hope. The Philippines has an educated, population base. The Philippines has people that are more, how do I put it, more globally mobile or globally capable, unlike many of your large neighbors. The Philippines did go down, regulatory, more openness on regulatory fronts many years before your other neighbors, on energy, oil and gas, power, etc., etc. The Philippines does have a somewhat unique corporate structure compared to other neighbors, in the sense of several large family-owned conglomerates. Now, we see them all across ASEAN, but what Philippines doesn't quite have is some of the large SOEs, state-owned companies, etc., that dominate the economy now. On the positive side, this does create a potential for dynamism, i.e., the private sector taking the lead as they did during COVID. So I would say that there is cause for optimism, and I think we should look forward with confidence, not complacence. We cannot be complacent, not at all. But I think we should be confident. Now, what do you do? Looking forward? As I said, the private-public partnership, very important, not confrontation, and we do see some degree of confrontation in some of your other countries, some of your other neighbors, but collaboration. We do think that this reskilling of people, of workers at scale, not reskilling 1,000 people or 5,000 people, but 1 million people over the next 18 months. That's very important. That's important for social reasons. It's important for economic reasons. Empowering or figuring out a way to reach out to SMEs and micro SMEs, which in the Philippines, depending on how you count them, account for between 80, 90, 95% of employment, 60% of your enterprises, very important. So these are some of the ideas. And we do think, keeping an eye on ESG opportunities, they have taken a back seat in the crisis, for the right reasons. They will be very important. There will be opportunities to be had. And certainly in the Philippines, which has a tradition of renewables and so on.
Okay, and Hans, I'd like to come to you. First of all, I see you nodding along a lot there, so I don't know whether you'd like to add anything to what Kaushik was saying.
No, I mean, I couldn't agree more. And I think what I would like to stress also is that the fact that the Philippines is catching up is a great sign. And things, perhaps the Philippines not always had the right policies in place to attract these investments in the past. But things can be very different. I mean, if you would have said 6 years ago, if you look at Jakarta, who would have predicted how many leading regional tech companies are now emerging in Indonesia? The thing can change very fast. And also, I think, I think that's, and the Philippines is placed in the most dynamic region in the world. And it's indeed, the question is how it's going to take advantage of that. But I totally agree with Kaushik, and also with Dindo, the opportunity is already there. And it's just a question of having the right policies to take advantage of them. And I couldn't agree more. I mean, the Philippines also has one of the best educated workforces in the region. So the conditions are there, and now we hope that the Philippines will take advantage of them.
And Hans, just to build on your earlier answer, as I already mentioned, this pandemic has highlighted vulnerabilities in global supply chains and has also served to accelerate what was already a pre-existing trend of manufacturing companies, particularly looking to diversify their production bases away from China. And we saw in Kaushik's presentation, ASEAN is by far the most popular destination at the moment for companies wishing to do that. But there's this tendency towards Indochina and particularly Vietnam. So what are your thoughts on how a country like the Philippines could become more competitive with a country like Vietnam in attracting these kind of investments? And on this broader issue, obviously the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, was recently agreed to. How might this impact investments in the Philippines and the broader region on the manufacturing side?
So the question is, why is everybody, just to simplify it a little bit, for the sake of discussion, why is everybody going to Vietnam?
Not the Philippines.
And not the Philippines. One reason is because everybody's going to Vietnam. That's where everybody is going. But there are also good reasons for this, because the Vietnamese government, has been very focused on attracting these companies and building the industrial base so they could thrive. Another country that has not been doing that is Indonesia, and that's why nobody is going there. Only the companies are only going there for the domestic market. While to Vietnam, they really go for exports and the more traditional ASEAN model. So I think if the Philippines would focus more on building up an industrial base and try to understand and work with these companies to attract them, I think there are great opportunities to get more investments to come to the Philippines. But for the moment, I hear very few of these companies seriously considering that. And that's often I ask them, why are you not thinking about the Philippines? And they look at you in amazement. What are you talking about? So this will require a bit of work to really have them think about this in a different way.
Dindo, I'd like to come to you here. First, just broadly building on this issue, what could the Philippines do to become more attractive in this highly competitive scenario?
I think we need to accept the reality that you need stable policy environment. You need an environment where businesses, both foreign and local, feel that they will not be seen as an enemy of government. I think we have seen that with some conglomerates that has been blamed for some mistakes that when you analyze it, it could have been the failure of some agencies of government. I'm talking about public-private partnerships that's been under attack even before this pandemic. So on our part, we did a study third quarter last year, and again, with a follow-up study this year with our polling partner, Pulse Asia, where we saw the Filipino people across social demographics, that means from the poorest of the poor to the class A, B, and C, sees the value of the private sector in generating investment for development. And in this pandemic, we even added a new angle, which is in terms of recovery. That critical role can be played by the private sector. So I think the role of government needs to be is to create this environment for the private sector to invest more. We need to calibrate a recovery program in the Philippines to overcome the economic consequences of this pandemic already, to really get the private sector, who is seen by 85% of the people as of September, that they will play a role. And out of that 85%, 90% of them feel that they play a big role in generating jobs. And jobs will help boost the consumption-driven economy that has been the main driver of economic growth in this country. But you cannot expect the private sector to do that when what you hear from government is always the whole of government instead of the whole of society. No, we need to see the value that in this challenge that we have in this pandemic, it's not only government that has really been harnessed. Civil society, NGOs, the private sector has played a role. But our government narrative has always been focused with government, what the government has done. But in the end, the government will not create the investments that will address this economic problem. It's the private sector. So we need both sector to work together. And you need to create, the government needs to create that environment for the sector to feel confident that their investment will really prosper and on their part, indirectly generate the necessary economic recovery through job creation and livelihood opportunities.
And on this note, Dindo, if we talk about the government creating the environment, the Duterte administration is about to enter its final full year in office, and the legislative agenda, there's still quite a lot to do. You know, there's wide-ranging investment reforms that are still pending in Congress. Obviously, CREATE recently was agreed to by the Senate, but we still have things that were mentioned, you know, the Public Services Act, the Foreign Investment Act, the Retail Trade Liberalization Act. Which of these do you think could be most effective at attracting impactful foreign investments during the rest of the Duterte term? And what are your expectations for actually progress to be made in the 18th and 19th Congress on these key reforms?
I see we are down to maybe less than a year in terms of legislation, given we will enter a political cycle by the last quarter of next year, the election cycle. So I see the Public Service Act, the Foreign Investment Act, and hopefully even the retail amendments to all these three acts, Retail Act, the Philippines, can really push a better environment for investments. And I don't really see any attempt by forces within the Philippines to really stop it from moving. What's happening in the Senate, I believe, is that they're trying to really look into the content more than what happened in the House of Representatives, which simply passed along this legislation. We've seen that in the CREATE bill. It was just passed in the Senate, but I think this is a better version than what was being passed or what was being pushed 2 years ago under Tax Reform 2. So I'm hoping that the Philippine Senate gets the opportunity after they pass the budget of 2021, that as they reconvene by January and they make the most of their session in the first half of the year and really push some of this investment legislation that will create the necessary environment for business to grow in the country, both domestic and foreign, because even domestic investors, I think, will benefit as they can create partnerships, as they can bring in technology with a more open economy.
And Ron, I'd like to come back to a topic you were touching on before regarding exacerbating inequality as a result of the pandemic. Now, at the same time as this, we've already touched on some issues related to the digital economy. And of course, the digital economy offers opportunities to also address inequalities. It's come up already during this event, Indonesia, and the fact that it has a very vibrant digital economy. We've seen huge growth in startups in ed tech, for example, and telemedicine during the pandemic. Already there was a very vibrant fintech ecosystem in Indonesia with a lot of e-wallets and e-payments. But unfortunately, there's been fewer success stories in the Philippines in terms of, for example, unicorns coming and taking a large role in the market. What more do you think can be done to boost entrepreneurship in the country and catalyze growth of innovative companies in these areas, and thereby, of course, extending the benefits of the digital economy to a wider proportion of society?
Well, Patrick, I think several things we can do, and you've been talking about it already. Increased openness to foreign investments, particularly those that bring in the types of technology we want to catch up on, will be useful for the Philippines. But I think one of the things that we should as a nation engage in now is the discussion of considering internet access as a national public good, and devising a national roadmap to actually increase the possibility that all of us will have some degree of access to the internet, which will have positive externalities on many other aspects of the economy and society, on education, on firms having access, but even on the health applications, which would presumably be enhanced with such a potential policy. And I think internet access as a national public good is something whose time has come in the Philippines. We are a very young population, and leveraging this kind of technology could actually distinguish us from many other countries already, because of, we're well known for being Facebook users, TikTok users, and all of this. But we should also consider the many other investments necessary to make this a force for reform and force for democracy in terms of access to the internet, which I'm talking here about investing also in making our population less vulnerable to disinformation, less vulnerable to fake news, and many other ancillary investments in the education sector that will allow us to actually leverage this as a force for change, not just for the economy, but also for our democracy. So I think this is one thing that we should consider in terms of Build Back Better. And the other thing I already mentioned, which is to strengthen the health sector.
Okay, thank you. Kaushik, I'd like to bring in your perspective here. You touched on it already, the idiosyncrasies in some way of the Philippines economy, in that, there's a very large dominance of legacy family conglomerates. When it comes to the digital space, of course, a lot of the innovation comes from these companies, which is fantastic. But do you think there's more that could be done to encourage synergies and partnerships with startups and young entrepreneurs in the country? Like we see, for example, in Indonesia, a lot of the ideas have come from startups like Gojek, for example. How can that be encouraged in Philippines, and should it be encouraged?
Well, that's in some ways it's a difficult question. I mean, the answer is yes, should be encouraged. The question is how. Indonesia benefited from a couple of things. And by the way, I spent quite some time in Indonesia myself personally. I used to lead our office there. There was a virtuous cycle of a large population. And as you know, the massive funding inflows that came in as a result of, SoftBank and Alibaba and others kind of getting interested. And then that built into a virtuous cycle where, investment came in, companies kind of used the money. They did innovate. I mean, there are some real innovations coming out of these tech companies, and they've kind of built up from there. Not a lot of those companies are still profitable, but, they're highly valued. and that gives them confidence. What they've also done is they have attracted a whole generation of young talent into these companies. So people that used to want to go and work with, large state-owned companies or others, found them prestigious, suddenly wanted to work in these tech companies. And by the way, we've suffered too. I mean, we in McKinsey like to think of ourselves as being one of the preeminent attractors of talent everywhere in the world. But we lost a lot of talent to these tech companies. In fact, some of the biggest tech unicorns are actually founded by McKinsey alumni, Gojek included. Now, the question is, how does somebody else replicate that? I mean, obviously you don't have the population base that Indonesia is. Still a large population, but it's not quite the size of Indonesia. You have a very educated population, compared to many other parts of the world, compared to other parts of ASEAN. How do you get that virtuous mix of funding, experimentation? Failure is okay. People, we've seen many of our alumni, they start a company, doesn't work, they go to another company, doesn't work, they go to a third company, suddenly that works, and then it's all famous. So, there are lots of complex things here. And I do want to say the family-owned conglomerates, companies, they are very important. They can be important investors. They can be important finders and accelerators of these things. In many ways, family companies can take long-term view of things in a way that listed companies cannot. So this in no way diminishes them. Now, I think a couple of things, more tactical that could be relevant. One is just creating a sandbox, creating some sort of sandbox where people can play, where people can experiment without getting beaten if things don't work. I mean, in Singapore, the Monetary Authority has been very thoughtful about sandboxes and about adjusting the sandboxes, over time. Second is, a degree of exposure around this being okay. The current president of Indonesia has several of these young entrepreneurs in his ministry, the current Minister for Education, for example. But beyond that, has a young people advisory committee, some 10 or 12 people that are all, young folks that have been creating new companies, which includes many of these tech people, including some that have actually not been that successful. Yeah, and that just showcases, spotlights people out there and creates a bit of a virtuous cycle, pulling more people in. And then, regulatory help or support, or deregulatory help or support. In Indonesia and in many other countries, we've seen a battle. When Gojek and Grab started to grow, there was pushback from from legacy companies. Multiple ministers stepped into that debate, often on different sides of the debate. And then an ability of the government of the country to find a way, which is not unfair for legacy companies, but allows some of the younger companies to experiment and try new things. Becomes very important. Some of these debates have been heated. We've seen ministers passing a law and then the president overruling that law in short order. So so just how do you get ahead? How do you create that environment where people can experiment, can fail, and come out okay?
Yeah,
I'm sure my colleagues from Philippines will have deeper answers onto this.
Yeah, I mean, I would like to say that the BSP, I think, under Governor Diokno is, very much in favor of encouraging innovation in the fintech space and has been proactive in creating a sandbox. And I know there's huge targets on the digital payment side, but it's lagging, obviously, a little bit behind at the moment. I don't know whether Ron or Dindo would like to add anything to what Kaushik just said on this topic.
Again, of course, it's good to get some of these companies, Filipino companies, to really be more open and work with also government. I think we need government also to create that environment, and aside from that environment, to even invest in terms of infrastructure for the digital transformation. So we need really all sectors of society, because it is very critical. We have seen how we have transformed with this pandemic and how digital technology plays an important role in Philippine society now, both at work, both at day-to-day living. So And we need also telcos, and it's good that telcos are rising to the challenge of investing in the infrastructure that is necessary. And we hope that the bureaucratic challenges that they have raised as an issue can be overcome. But we also need maybe for a more open environment for other players to really up the level of technology and also investments in the infrastructure space for the digital transformation to really happen in the country.
Kaushik, very quickly, I just want to come back to you for a final point on this topic. You mentioned in your presentation about job displacement and upskilling, with about approximately 19.3 million workers in the Philippines might need to be skilled or upskilled in the near future. And presumably, you know, this is a phenomenon that's taking place across emerging Asia at the same time. Are there any regional countries that offer the best examples on how to approach this dilemma of job displacement and upskilling? And where do you think are the biggest mismatches at the moment, perhaps in the Philippine labor market?
Look, absolutely. I mean, this is a big problem across the world, both in the emerging markets, our kind of markets, as well as in the developed markets. In some ways, you could draw a line between some of this and some of the political trends in recent times, and folks that have kind of come to power, etc. Now, within our region, maybe an example I would draw on is Singapore. Now, I know it's a small country, small population, etc., and much easier in some ways to kind of move to action. But I think the government has been proactive in thinking about this. So, for example, just to give you some examples, the government created a big showcase digital capability center. It's a center. It's in partnership with one of the universities here, the Nanyang. I'm stumbling over the words. NTU, Nanyang Technological University. I think I'm stumbling over the words again. But NTU, the government's A-STAR is the Scientific Technology Research Agency. Yeah, they created an entity called the ARTC. So together with the university, it's a collaboration with the private sector. There are many companies that have showcased their technology there. They actually do live research there. We actually happen to be the knowledge partner. But this is a brilliant facility where people can come, they get trained, they learn, they can do brainstorming. Students can come, corporate executives come. We know many ministers from many ASEAN countries have visited there, to learn about new technology, and then they've gone back and said, now we want to do the same in our country. So so a few showcase places, physical locations where people can get trained, people can get inspired. But at a more substantial level, being very thoughtful about skilling of, say, for example, SMEs and micro SMEs, where the government works with, there are some government agencies, the ESG, WHM, there are specific government agencies working with the private sector, by the way, for training and capability building, where the government underwrites the small companies, experimentation with things. So the first set of sensors getting placed in the company at a specific place, that's underwritten partly or fully by the government, along with experts that will go there, that will visit, that will help you get the first use case in place. Now, if you see benefits and you want to expand, then you pay for it. Maybe at some, you're helped with the finance, but then the second round, the company has to pay. But the first round, that initiation, that experimentation, and the first round of training is underwritten by the government and by government, government-led agencies. That's a very interesting way of getting SMEs to experiment and then to take this technology out. Then at an individual level, the government's been, there have been sort of vouchers and, cash incentives and then, et cetera, for people to train up again. I mean, I recently, I got a mail which says, I could use up to $1,500 in 3 different tranches if I wanted to go for retraining. Now, I'm not planning to use that because I don't think I should call on state resources myself. But, these resources are available. Along with that, the government's been out attracting reskilling-oriented companies and corporates. So, for example, we have a non-profit part to McKinsey called Generations that works in this space. And actually the government, or when the government agencies reached out and, invited them to come to Singapore, et cetera, et cetera. So, there's been a lot of proactive thinking here. So on each of these fronts, individuals, SMEs, or micro companies, as well as medium-sized companies, there is a lot that governments can do to accelerate change, to accelerate adoption, and to take out the risk that some of these companies face in trying new technology.
Yes, Hans, please.
Yeah, Patrick, would like to add at one point to what Kaushik said. So we see what Kaushik said about the tech companies in Indonesia, and we've seen these companies going regional. And we see a company like Gojek has expanded all over Southeast Asia. It's the exception of one country. They are not in the Philippines. And you know why? Because the government has blocked their entrance. And that's a typical example of not a missed case, of a missed opportunity. Why are they not allowed to operate in the Philippines? So the government should be welcoming them with open arms.
And Ron, I saw you were also very animated on the topic of skills development and job displacement. Would you like to add anything here on this particular topic and the challenge in the Philippines?
Yes, thank you, Patrick. I am, after all, a dean of a school of government, so we are into skilling. And I think part of the challenge also is to instill in our public sector this broader notion to appreciate experimentation and failure, because probably we are not training many of our young people very well because they're so afraid of failure. But at the same time, we need to create a system, an ecosystem, where they're able to learn from these failures, from this experimentation. And I agree with Kaushik. There are a few examples out there in the world. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. When I visited National University of Singapore, they actually have a part of the campus where faculty, young people, and the private sector can collaborate on startups. This is the kind of platform that can be brokered through public-private partnerships. And I think it's much stronger given the political economy of the Philippines. It's much stronger if the private sector is somehow involved. And also the academia and civil society groups, as Professor Manhit also mentioned. There's greater transparency, there's better chance of governance, so that you don't, I think part of the fear is that you keep on supporting infants who never grow up, supporting not based on competitiveness, but because of political connections. And I think those are the scars actually that my country is still recovering from. So when we're talking about these bold policies to support public goods, to support partnerships, we need to think of the institutions and the platforms of transparency to make it work this time.
Thank you. Hans, we have a little bit of time left before we go to the audience. I'd like to touch on an issue that I know you're keen to talk about, which is green energy. There's been a lot of talk with the drop in carbon emissions that accompanied the lockdowns all over the world. There's a lot of debate about whether we can look towards a green recovery, underpinned by investments in green energy and sustainable infrastructure. Now, this is a country that obviously has, long-term rising energy demand. It also has infrastructure deficit, and it has a government very much focused on building infrastructure. So what do you think are the prospects in the Philippines of a green recovery underpinned by green energy? And why should the Philippines be looking to catalyze more investment in green energy?
Green energy is now the cheapest source of energy. So it's a fantastic opportunity to actually save costs and move to clean energies. And actually the whole transition for societies to move to zero emissions is really maybe one of the biggest job creators in the world in the next 20, 30 years. So it's important that the Philippines also sees this and embarks on this as a way to grow the economy.
Dindo, I'd like to ask you a question. This is more on the geopolitical side, but obviously we have seen during the pandemic period arguably increased Chinese assertiveness in the region, particularly towards, for example, Hong Kong and Taiwan. And also at the same time, efforts by China to distinguish itself in terms of its medical diplomacy as a model example of how to deal with the pandemic. In sharp contrast, to be honest, to the US and some European countries, including my own. So now we have the prospect of a Biden presidency from January. How do you think this might impact US policy towards the region, particularly the Philippines? What might this mean for trade in the recovery phase?
Patrick, of course, we have seen that given this pandemic, and you try to analyze the security environment, we have really seen the value of viewing things not only from a traditional sense, but from a non-traditional sense, in terms of even issues of health and pandemic, even issues of green recovery, climate change, or even issues of economic security. But one thing that we saw common during this, especially in the early part, was even the attempt of China to control the narrative. And that was quite dangerous. Even in the Philippines, we did study on, I think, end of second quarter, on should we make China accountable for keeping this virus news or virus information from the general public globally. And we see a big number of Filipinos, I think nearly 7 out of 10, believing China should be made accountable. But it's a reality really that we need to view things that to learn from where we are now. I'm hoping that as we try to push for a more rules-based, for a more secure and peaceful region, we need to harness countries that share values. And when I speak of sharing values, I'm not only speaking of the possibility of a more respected leadership from the United States with the Biden presidency, but also going beyond this strategic competition between China and the US and see the value of what I call middle powers, who share values of democracy, who can really drive a more peaceful, democratic, and rule-based order in the region. I'm speaking of the possible role of Japan, South Korea, Australia. So we need really to build this strategic partnership and alliances to ensure an order that will be driven by rules, driven by democratic values, and respect for one's territory. At the end of the day, we need to respect each other's maritime integrity and territorial sovereignty based on what international law describes. In the end, we can all grow and build a more robust, strong Asia-Pacific economic region collectively.
I think it's a really interesting topic that we could take in many ways. I think this question is for the panel, and anyone who wishes to answer it can answer it. You talk about a rules-based order, and when we talk about trade rules, obviously under the Trump presidency, the US has taken a step back from drawing the trade rules in the region. Do you expect under a Biden presidency there might be more of an attempt to forge the rules of the game within the region, whether that's through joining the CPTPP or whether coming up with some other kind of framework? And would that be welcome, do you think, from a Philippine perspective? Hans, you're unmuted, so maybe I'm going to ask you to answer that question.
Oh, thank you, Patrick. I think what we have to understand that the Biden presidency will first of all be focused on their domestic issues. And by the way, he has not been elected. He doesn't have no mandate to join or rejoin the CPTPP. What we can expect from a Biden presidency is to take a much more multilateral approach. And that means, and it's very important, and that means restoring the credibility and the functioning of the WTO. But beyond that, I think we can expect little of them of trade architecture in Asia Pacific. Perhaps later in his presidency, if at all.
Okay, would anyone else like to comment on this issue before we move on to the audience questions? Otherwise, I can move on. Okay, so I'm going to start with a few questions from the audience. This first one says, and again, it's not directed to anyone in particular, so I would suggest perhaps this one would be more appropriate for either Ronald or Dindo to answer, or both. The question is, what about the 1987 Constitution, which is so restrictive to foreign direct investment and discourages foreigners to get into the Philippines? Should this be taken into account, and what should be done about it?
I'll take the first crack on it. I think we live in a totally different world since 1987. There is that mechanism that we can amend the Constitution. The problem with the Philippines is all about changing the Constitution. It's time for us really to see where it needs or can be amended to create a more open economy, create a better investment environment. Because I think if it will be explained to the Filipino people that this will lead to greater opportunities for job creation, that means better livelihood opportunities for them, there will be broad support for this. But if we will always create this fear that foreign investments is against our sovereignty, which is the fear mongering that has been created by some civil society groups, ideologically biased, it creates it polarizes group. But if it's seen really from what is a core concern of the Filipinos today, especially as we try to recover from this pandemic, that this is an opportunity to broaden lives in terms of job creation and alleviate poverty on the long term.
Yes, I'll just add on to Patrick. I think tinkering with the Constitution is a very sensitive process, and one which ideally is accompanied by an environment of high social cohesion, of high trust, and high unity in the country towards that direction of improving on that very important document. So it's unfortunate for me to observe that it has become sort of a dividing issue rather than a uniting issue in the country. And I would rather see the suggestion of Professor Manhit that strong evidence be presented towards amending or adjusting the Constitution, you probably using a scalpel rather than an axe, to look at where it can be improved so that people understand the parts of it and are better able to appreciate it. I think actually, and adding to Professor Manhit's idea, that we need strong institutions to accompany that greater economic openness that we all aspire for. So I'm an economist. I also support greater openness of our economy to foreign investors. But there are also some other factors that nations now need to consider. And I agree with Professor Manhit. This is a very different world from 1987. Many countries actually have national security reviews on foreign investors to make sure that these investments that come into the country do not contradict their other policy objectives, such as strengthening national security. And I think in today's world, it is only prudent to have those types of institutions.
Thank you very much. I think this next question is somewhat linked in terms of legislation around foreign investment, and perhaps also more appropriate for the same two panelists, but of course, everybody is welcome to answer. The question is, does the recent passage of the CREATE bill bode well for foreign investment attraction? Will it really contribute to the stimulation of the economy? And what other legislation might be useful to help us through the contraction of recent quarters?
Yes, I think the version of CREATE bill now, or was passed the Senate, and I think will be adopted by the House of Representatives, provides us with that opportunity. It lowers corporate income tax, and it also tries to manage these challenges on the incentive process that has been questioned by our own economic managers in the Philippines. But as I've said, we still have pending legislation like the Public Service Act or the Foreign Investment Act amendments that can really open the economy, maybe provide some guidelines in terms of security issues like the Public Service Act, as mentioned by Dean Ron earlier. I can cite that Public Service Act, the fear that it might be used as a backdoor by some investors, might have some security issues. But there are these two pending, and maybe even the retail trade liberalization, because it's a good way to really drive more consumption and more open to the consumers in the Philippines. So those three legislations I continue to watch out for. As I've said, we're down to maybe less than a year of actual legislation. So hopefully our own Senate can really do their jobs as they have been elected to view things from a more national point of view, not parochial concern, and see it as an opportunity to have a better investment environment in a post-pandemic Philippines.
Patrick, just to add on to that, since you asked about CREATE, I think the track record of this administration is good in terms of passing legislation, but mixed in terms of implementing that legislation well. So I hope that a true reform agenda, even this late in the game, is somehow attached to the passage of an important reform like CREATE. This is being introduced under a pandemic situation when we have many other tasks to consider. And I dare say that we are still reeling from the effects of Train 1 and rice tarification in terms of properly implementing this and making sure that we actually harvest the better part of the reform rather than a mismatch of results from poor implementation. So I think that's the concern that I would just attach to what is good on paper. CREATE is a good reform on paper, but it entails a lot of institutional strengthening and proper implementation in order to get the best out of that reform.
Thank you, Ran. Okay, I'm going to move on to a very different topic now. I'll direct this initially to Hans, but if anybody else would like to answer it afterwards, then that's absolutely fine, of course. This question from an audience member says, do you think the RCEP is pandemic proof? And will it really contribute to the stimulation of the Philippine economy?
Pandemic proof? I don't know what you mean.
Pandemic proof. So I guess that would mean, will it stand up to the challenges, or will it help to overcome the challenges of the pandemic? And will it really contribute to the stimulation of the economy? Perhaps you can expand just a bit more on the RCEP here and what are the implications for the Philippines, and what are the pros and what are the cons?
So, sorry, our RCEP is really unique. It's unique in the sense that it's the first time, of course, that is a free trade agreement that involves Japan, China, Korea, and Southeast Asia. So the opportunities are really there because the rules of origins are relatively low. So that means that companies are likely to focus their supply chains in countries that are members of RCEP. And as we discussed earlier, this is another opportunity for the Philippines to take and to grow its economy, to grow its investments, and also grow its exports, and also to those countries, to China, to Japan, and Korea. There's also a danger. There's a danger of trade diversion from the Philippines, perhaps to China, Japan, China, Korea. Those is the first time that those countries have a free trade agreement. But overall, it should be viewed, I think, very positively, and also an important political statement of all these countries that they want to be part of a free trade region.
Kaushik, I saw that you unmuted yourself at the same time as Hans. I don't know whether you'd like to add something here on this point about RCEP.
No, nothing to add.
Okay. And then there's another question from the audience, which is somewhat linked, and I think we've already touched on this already, but I'd like to ask it, and anyone is welcome to answer. Vietnam has easy access to the immense China supply chain for parts. Can the Philippines do anything to duplicate this? This is on the issue of Vietnam that we've touched on already and the competitiveness. I think, Hans, you talked about it at length. I don't know whether anyone has anything to add on this particular point.
So what was the question, Patrick?
So the question was, Vietnam has easy access to the immense China supply chain for parts. Can the Philippines do anything to replicate this?
Of course, yeah, of course. But you only have a slight advantage because, as we discussed earlier, people are moving from China to Vietnam because many people are doing that, and that creates critical mass. But if a government would really actively pursue this opportunity, I think this can also be built in the Philippines. I mean, the Philippines is also next door to China. So yes, it can be done.
Okay, excellent. And then the final question, it's directed to Mr. Das, to Kaushik. However, I think on this, it might be a nice point to end on. So it'd be good to hear from all panelist members on the same question. But I'll ask you first, Kaushik. What are the top 3 specific things that you think the country should prioritize right now to enable the recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic?
Listen, the absolute first thing, healthcare, and start thinking about vaccine distribution. It does feel that vaccines are going to come around. We'll get to Asia, if not this calendar year, certainly Q1, Q2 next calendar year. Start preparing for that so that is not chaotic. That's the second thing I would say. While preparing for the vaccine, continuing to take care of vulnerable sections of society. They will need help. They will continue to need help for some time to come. Those would be my first 2 things. And the third thing, if I had, and I know I've mentioned this before, think ahead about people that are long-term impacted, not just by COVID, but by secular trends around technology, around digitization, etc. How do you prepare them for the new world? If they are not prepared long-term, the country cannot move forward.
Thank you. I'm going to move across my screen from left to right. So that brings me next to Hans. And just to ask you the same question, whether you have any different points to add to Kaushik on the 3 things the Philippines should prioritize right now to enable the recovery.
I agree. And may at one point, and this, we've talked quite a bit Vietnam. I think what's also important to understand is that Vietnam is a magical place. That means Vietnam is still quite a difficult place for foreign companies to invest and operate. So one more reason for the Philippines also to understand their real opportunities for growth and attract investments as well.
Okay, and the next on my screen brings me to Dindo.
Yeah, as I've said earlier, this is a continuing public health crisis, and it has had its economic consequences. So I'd like to focus my points on those things. Number 1, we have to accept that this has really been a challenge to society as a whole in terms of inequality. We've seen how the pandemic has affected the lower class more, and how can really government deal with this disparity, and how can the public overcome this given this long lockdown. And part of that really is, given that this is a long economic emergency, that initially your first thinking would be, how can we resurrect our consumer-based economy that has driven our growth? But it also should be seen as an opportunity to see things differently, transform ourselves, not only consumption-driven, but really investment-led growth by really opening up the economy, creating a better investment environment. And part of that is, how do we digitally transform Philippine society? We have seen, I did some work in education in the past as a former deputy minister or undersecretary, and I've seen the digital divide when I introduced ICT in Philippine public education. Just comparing it with my family and the experiences of public school children. But still, that is what is in front of us today. And how can we digitally transform if we don't build on the competencies or capabilities of our own people at the educational system, at the workplace level also. So those, I believe, are the things that we should be focused on.
And last but by no means least, the final word to Ronald.
Yes, thank you, Patrick, and thank you to the colleagues who have already outlined some important elements. I'm just going to reiterate, it's the health sector. I think there's potential to build back better as far as the healthcare industry, maybe even boost healthcare tourism at some future point, and also implement vaccine access in a very fair and efficient way when we do get access. It's important for us to do that well in order to achieve the inclusive recovery that we want. I think many of the things that work well for us are still there. We were, after all, one of the fastest growing economies in the world prior to COVID-19. And we still have that firepower with us here in this country. But we can envision a stronger country after COVID-19 by learning the lessons from the pandemic, which is to actually strengthen the inclusiveness of our healthcare system, strengthening the inclusiveness of our education system, to protect that from long-term unequalizing impact of COVID-19, but also to respond to many of the things that Kaushik also mentioned that are structural trends that we were already facing in terms of the fourth industrial revolution, automation, things that were beginning to impact on the Philippines even prior to COVID-19, which according to the forecast, at least by these experts, is just going to accelerate even more. So if we had a timeline before, now it is an accelerated timeline. The peak of the youth population in the country is around 2045, 2050, if the UN population projections are correct. So the time to invest in our young people is actually now. We should not break that. And that, I think, is going to be the basis for our long-term competitiveness. So we should not forget it.
Thank you. Well, that brings us to the end of this opening panel discussion. Thank you so much to all the panelists who shared their insights, and thank you as well to all the audience members who joined us for this discussion.
Many thanks to all of you who joined our panel, to the gentlemen for sharing your interesting thoughts on the new normal for the Philippines as well as Asia. We are now almost halfway through today's program. But before we go on break, our virtual room sponsor, Eastern Communications, would like to share with us a few details about their background and their products and services. Stay tuned because they are also giving away prizes for their mini game, which will happen in a short while. So without further ado, let me turn you over to Eastern Communications.
Everyone knows that true success comes from strong connections built and established over time. Whether it's a connection between you and your business partners or your company and your consumers. At Eastern Communications, we believe in a strong and personal connection. In prioritizing both our high-tech and our high-touch solutions, we bring back the human connection in the ever-expanding industry of information and communications technology. In doing so, we've amassed a wide array of various solutions designed to not only improve our clients' businesses, but to also create seamless experiences for their own customers. This is why customized solutions and strong connections matter so much to us. Keep your company files safe and secure through data centers and cloud services that allow easy access for your employees and are scalable to match the needs of your business. We understand just how important proper collaboration and communication are to the success of a business, which is why we can offer your company the proper tools needed to enhance collaboration efficiency, all while maintaining an agile and flexible network that is scalable to the size of your company. These collaboration tools are key to developing your business's continuity and are easily accessible at any time and from any device, all while maintaining the security your company needs. Speaking of security, no matter what stage of a cyber attack you are in, Eastern Communications will always ensure that your company is prepared with the help of the Cyber Defense Suite. From before the attack happens, during the time it's in progress, And even after it begins to damage systems and steal information, Eastern Communications is equipped with products and services for every phase. Eastern also provides relevant managed services that suit your company's needs. That way, you can better focus on running your business and leave the technical aspect up to us. Of course, every business needs reliable connectivity in order to maintain its day-to-day processes. Our world-class data services ensure the smoothest flow of data and information for your company. Together, we can help you create personalized networks that are well-suited for your company's specific needs, containing all of the benefits with none of the hassle. If it's internet you need, Eastern Communications Internet Services can provide your company with fast connections and high bandwidth availabilities. This way, you have access to flexible speeds and stronger connections to the internet. Lastly, we want to help you establish your own strong connections with your company's partners and customers. Eastern's voice services offers seamless solutions for your customer service needs and easily connects you to your customers. These are only some of the many solutions and services that Eastern Communications has established over the years for our many partners. And while we still have a long way to go, you can be sure that Eastern Communications will continue to be your partner and take you from where you are now to where you want to go. Together, we can all finish strong for our tomorrow.
I'll just wait for the next slide. So Eastern Communications, if you're not so familiar with us, we've been a passenger of time. We have been around for the past 143 years, starting up as a connectivity company. So you will notice from our old products, we have the data, the internet, and the voice services. However, about 2 years ago, we have become a full-blown ICT company in that we have delved into the managed services of cyber securities, data centers, and the cloud. And so with that, on our second point, we want to show that we are the champions of high tech and high touch. While we thrive in development and the delivery of new technologies, we also don't forget about the personal touch. So aside from being high tech, we are also high touch. So with that, we have emerged into a full-blown ICT. We have managed services, data center and cloud services, cyber defense services. So we are the champions of high tech and high touch. So to be able to do this, we have partnered with the top companies of the industry, which is the telco industry, for the high tech. So if you're also familiar with these companies, they're the ones whom we go to whenever we need products such as routers, firewalls, and other cybersecurities. These are companies like Cisco, Huawei, Samsung, TP-Link, and the others. Fortinet also. So that's for the high tech part. Now for the high touch, we have to also partner ourselves with the top organizations such as AmCham and the other chambers of commerce like the European, the British, and the German chambers of commerce, as well as some local companies or some local organizations such as the IBPOP, the CCAP, and the HIMAP. Now, we also have a presence in the international scene. So other partners in the international, among international companies are DOS Arrest, Singtel, Vodafone, PCCW, Google, and these are some of the more familiar companies that you always hear about. So with that, we receive a lot of we receive a lot of awards from international bodies such as the Anvil, Stevie Awards, and of late we receive a very significant award, which is the Top Telco Award, given by the 2020 Asia Leaders Awardee. So before going on to the next presenter, I just would like to reiterate and repeat again our products. The old traditional ones are the internet services, data, and voice, and then the managed services composed of data and Eastern Cyber Defense. So now I would like to turn you over to a colleague of mine who would present 3 specific products and how it can possibly fit into the operations of most companies today, especially with the onslaught of the COVID pandemic. So the next one would be Veron Uy.
Veron, you're on mute.
Sorry. Hello. Hello, everyone. So we're on Eastern Communications. Hope you're all doing great. So that actually sums up the Eastern Communications product domains. You have been provided with wired and end-to-end solutions from wired to wireless solutions. As we now are more informed, and if you like to know more about Eastern on how to securely access your files, even working from home, feel free to take a screenshot of the next slide. Here presented is a QR code for securely accessing your files, even working from home. So you can take a screenshot or save this photo or just scanning the QR. So for the next slide, if you want to know more about how to enforce security and ensure safety of your data, you can scan the QR as presented on the screen. So the next one is, if you're looking for a customizable platform, you can scan the QR for an easy off-the-shelf cloud services. If you're looking for, if you want to talk to us directly, you can scan the QR for the next slide for our cluster heads in Eastern Communications. This is our cluster head, Sir Joey Chuico, the one who presented previously, and the other one is Jen Velasco. You can also save and take a screenshot of the next slide, our other cluster heads from, next slide, please. You can also communicate with Sir Peter Wong and Rina Obejas, our sales cluster heads in Eastern. Hope you gathered all the information that you need, because we are excited to know more about your company on how we can provide solutions and how we can help you and have a better performance on your operations on a better competitive price. So now let's take some time off, and for a quick and easy game. You can win prizes by joining Kahoot. You can go to kahoot.it as presented on the screen. You can download it on your app store, or so we will just present a game pin on your screen, so you can join the game by registering your full name. We hope that you register your full name so that if you win, we can